Hello friends, and welcome back to another bonus episode of the Jank Tank. This is bonus episode number 5. My name is Timothy Zaccanino, and I'm joined here by just Teld to talk some peasant action here. You've got the Bakersbane duo on the line together, which I guess that means we have to figure out which one of us is the raccoon and which one's the squirrel.
Ooh, I don't know. I think I'm raccoon energy, but like just looking at the picture of this guy, he is really into that pine, so I'm vibing with that today.
You know what? I can accept squirrel as default. I think I would have picked squirrel for myself, so that works out perfectly. We heard some positive feedback on the Modern Horizons 3 Peasant review, so we decided to make it a regular rotation, but still keep it under the guise of a bonus episode. Full disclosure, by the time you're listening to this, we will have already had our mainline cube review episode published. So we're going to talk about all the mechanics there and the set logistics in that episode. So if you are listening to this episode, we're going to kind of skip over most of that to just start talking about cards today. But I do recommend you go back to the previous episode, the mainline episode. I think it's going to be episode number 27, maybe 26. The Bloomburrow main set review, and listen to our take on different mechanics and our overall impressions of the set. But Teld and I are focusing on peasant stuff here today.
Good news. This time there's not 100 cards to talk about, so I'm in much better spirits.
Yeah, well, it's not a Modern Horizon set, but I am scrolling through and there's like 12 green cards on this list or something like that. There's a lot of speculative stuff. There's a lot of things that are like straightforward, yeah, we're going to play this and then move on. Peasant Cube stuff's a little bit easier to talk about than some of the theoretical stuff for the mainline cube, but we've still got quite a bit to talk about, and I think we're all excited for Bloomburrow, so we're excited to do this. As usual, just to kind of get the housekeeping out of the way, you can find our Discord wherever you're listening to this, or links to our Discord, rather, where you can come get in on the conversation, talk about the cards that you're interested in for the peasant environment or the mainline environment, and just give us your feedback, and of course come draft with us when Bloomburrow releases so that you can give us your feedback on the actual gameplay. I also received a decent amount of positive feedback about the kind of grading scale, or whatever you want to call it, the labels that we put on cards in the Modern Horizons 3 review. So just to kind of catch you up if you didn't listen to that review, instead of labeling things on like an A to F scale, we decided that we wanted to test out just putting labels on cards to kind of indicate where the card lands in a cube environment, specifically our cube environment, but cube environments as a whole. So instead of saying a card is like a B or a C, we're going to label it as, for instance, a role player, which is what most cards end up being, or a test card, something that we're unsure how it's actually going to play out, but we're going to try it out. And we're going to have certain modifiers, like we're going to, modal cards are going to get the flexible tag. Efficient cards that are just hyper efficient for their effect are going to get the efficient tag. And then a couple flags, which I don't think we have any red flag cards on this list this time. Modern Horizons 3 was full of red flag cards, but I didn't label any cards as red flag cards, so we shall see when we get into this. But before I guess we jump into the cards here, did you have anything you wanted to add about Bloomburrow that you anticipate you won't have already said in the main set review?
yeah, projecting myself into future me so that to help pass me out. I don't know. I mean, the set's cool. I'm sure I'm gonna go into more detail about it in the main episode, but
for sure,
yeah, I like it. It's nice to take a bit of a break from these super complex sets and draft what looks to be a little more of a not an easy set to draft or anything like that, but just a little bit less like mechanically dense.
Yeah, there's not a lot of big question mark cards in this review, right? Like the cards, there's a couple, but the cards for the most part say what they do, and we're just like slotting them in and cutting cards for them or considering them and stuff like that. And that's about all of it. Like there's a handful of cards that we're going to be like, where does this actually land? But for the most part, it's just like, okay, I know what this card does because it says what it does on the card, and we can grade it appropriately and decide whether or not it belongs in our cube. So it's kind of refreshing. Not a lot of the cards are going to give us pause here. We should be able to get through this in a timely manner, which, you're looking at the timestamp, I'm sure it says like 4 hours and 25 minutes on it or something. But the real test is to see how many cards we misread and then just decide like, oh, we probably shouldn't have talked about that card at all.
I actually discovered I have still misread cards. So this is just a small aside. Did you know that Preacher of the Schism one of its triggers works when you attack a player, which won't happen if you attack their planeswalker. But the other trigger, if it's available, still will.
I did know that because at the Pro Tour, not the last one, but the Pro Tour before it, that happened and somebody had to step away from the table to ask a judge for clarification. So that's the only reason I know about that. But yeah, I'm hoping there isn't a lot of that going on here, but maybe we'll misread a card or two, and if we do, like, just shout at us in the comments, we'll figure it out. But we have actually talked about these cards pretty extensively at this point, so as far as the recording session goes, I feel like we know what's going on, but we'll see. we'll see. With all that out of the way, do we want to go ahead and just jump into some cards here? We'll go in Wooburg order as we usually do. So let's go ahead and kick it off here with a Seasoned Warren Guard. This is a white mana for a 1/2 uncommon rabbit warrior. When it attacks, while you control a token, it gets +2/+0 until end of turn. Look at that. Simple, right? Like, I don't have to be like, oh, what does this card do? Like, I know exactly what this card does. It's a 1/2, and a lot of times it'll attack as a 3/2. Good enough, right? I think we're actually gonna consider this one for the mainline queue. Probably not as an all-timer, more as like a call out to like, hey, draft a tokens deck. But for us, for the Peasant Cube, this is just definitionally an archetypal card. For our tokens decks, we do explicitly support tokens and should attack as a 3/2 quite often. 1 mana 3/2 is a solid deal.
Yeah, I actually think this is a card you'll probably play anywhere in the Naya space. So I think you'd play this in Boros or in Green-White, even if Green-White's the one that probably more reliably makes tokens. I think the Peasant Cube, just in general, makes so many random game objects that I would be surprised if by turn 3, this card ever doesn't attack as a 3/2.
Yeah, I mean, it should, right? We have 2 Thraben Inspectors. I think like half of our 1-drop white section alone creates tokens, so and we explicitly support it. In the mainline cube, a little skeptical because there's just less incidental token making there than there is in the Peasant Cube. But this card just needs a token on board. It can be a treasure, it can be another creature token, just anything will do, and it's attacking as a 3/2. If you can't fulfill that condition, if we find out that this card is just a 1/2 like half the time and a 3/2 the other half, like, we probably just cut it. It's not good enough if it's a 1/2 like pretty consistently.
Yeah, it's a pretty big upgrade over Savannah Lions if it is attacking as a 3/2 consistently, though. So this gives me some hope that they've recognized that the 2/1 stat line on aggressive 1-drops is just not cutting it, and they're going to start to experiment with new ways to get those cards over the hump, even at common and uncommon.
Well, it turns out the 2/1 stat line on a 1-drop's good. You just have to put it in green instead of white or red, but
and add like a paragraph of text.
Yeah, exactly. Give it offspring. Speaking of which, another white creature here. We've got Intrepid Rabbit, 2 and a white for a 3/2 rabbit soldier. It has offspring for a single mana, so I guess we should go over what the mechanics do the first time we talk about them here without going super in depth. But this has offspring 1, and it says whenever this creature enters, target creature you control gets +1/+1 until end of turn. And offspring is basically just, you can pay that as a kicker cost, and if you do, when it enters the battlefield, you create a 1/1 copy of it. So this is a 3 mana 3/2 that pumps a creature by +1/+1 until end of turn. Or if you pay 4 mana, you get that card plus an additional 1/1 that also pumps a creature by +1/+1 until end of turn. So a really terrible 3-drop, but a really good 4-drop. So, I mean, I'm basically considering this a 4-drop creature. You kind of have to offspring it to want this card in your deck. If you don't, probably really weak. Like, that's just not a good card. But if you do offspring, this seems good.
I really hope that when people play this card in the cube, they don't think of it as a 3-drop. Like, it's going to be really unfortunate if somebody drafts this as a 3 in their deck, because this is not why we're putting it in the cube. It is very much a 4-drop.
Yeah, I mean, it's like emergency scenario. You can play it as a 3-drop, but you're really hoping not to. Like, if you just straight up have no play on 3 and you're on defense, like, you kind of have to just put it on board to trade off, and then it's probably just okay. But as like an offensive card, it's too weak to play this as a 3-drop, so hopefully you can curve into this on 4, and you just get like such an amplified effect on 4 because you're given +2/+2 or +1/+1 to 2 different creatures at the same time, which is going to open up some good attacks. So I like this bad boy, but under the caveat that this is a 4-drop, not a 3-drop, and we're going to go ahead and label this as a test card here. We might find out that, like, it's still just not that good if you have to, like, run it out on 3, like, a little bit too often, but I think you'll be able to maneuver things to have this actually occupy a 4-drop slot.
Well, I mean, the thing is it will be replacing a 4-drop in the cube. So if you just draft it under the assumption that it's a 4-drop, then the 3-mana mode is just pure upside, right? If this is a 4-drop and every once in a blue moon you have to cast as a 3-drop, that's something that a card that just literally did the same thing but only had the 4-mana text box on it would not be able to do. So
yeah, I mean, honestly, we could put the flexible tag on every single offspring creature for that exact reason, right? Because it's just 2 different cards in one, depending on whether you pay offspring or not. But we will label this as a test card. I imagine this card will get there, and Jank Diver drafters are smart enough to know, like, you want to save this on 4. Plus, Jank Diver drafters are greedy enough to know that they just want to get the full value of the card, whether they should play it on 3 or not. So, like, no one's ever running this out on 3.
Plus, every Jank Diver is watching our set reviews, right? And all of our bonus content. So, of course, they're all in the know anyways.
They know what's up. They know what's going on. That leads us to another test card here, and this is one that I'm advocating for pretty highly. I think you're a little bit lower on it than me, but I like the potential of this card. It is Do Drop Cure, 2 and a white for an uncommon sorcery. It has the gift mechanic, which means you can promise your opponent a gift for an amplified effect of the card. In this case, it's gift a card, which means you can allow your opponent to draw a card for the better effect here. So the effect is return up to 2 target creature cards with mana value 2 or less from your graveyard to the battlefield. If the gift was promised, so if you give your opponent a card, instead return up to 3 target creatures with mana value 2 or less from your graveyard to the battlefield. So when we talked about this a little bit behind the curtains, you kind of pointed out that, like, yeah, sometimes you just don't have cards in your graveyard. Sometimes it's actually pretty bad to, like, gift your opponent a card. Like, you can't just gift every single time. And a lot of times, like, you get to the point in the game where nothing's really died and you just have to, like, burn it to get back a 1-drop or a 2-drop, and that's not really good. But I do think there is enough upside. I'm not going to ignore a card that can get back 6 mana's worth of creatures for 3 mana, and that's why I want to test it out to see, like, what's the use case? Is it getting back 1 creature more often than not? Is it just doing the 3 mana get back 2 things, in which case it's just okay? Or is it a regular thing that this is getting back 3 creatures, in which case it's, like, excellent? So I'm not sure where you've landed on this one, but we are testing it out, basically because I've pushed to test it out.
Yeah, I mean, I think these reanimation effects are all generically kind of fine. I think I like this less than something like Lively Dirge or Unearth for different reasons in both cases. But I do think this card has a potential. I think there's probably less times than we think that you actually want to gift a card, though, depending on what deck you're against. Because, like, if you're playing against a green deck, right, and they've just got a bunch of, like, really, really impactful 4s, 5s, 6s in their deck, then every time you give them a draw step, you're taking a chance that they just invalidate your entire board. That being said, the white decks are also really synergistic. They tend to have these sort of engine-y sort of things going on and have a lot of ETBs and things like that, so you could get more cards worth of value. I do think the inability to get 3-drops on this one does limit it a little bit, which is part of why I mentioned it like Lively Dirge better, is you can split that 4 up however you want. So I kind of wish they had went and said, you know, return up to 2 creatures with total mana value 4 or less, and then bumped it up to 3 creatures with 6 or less. Obviously, it would have made the card better. It would have made it a little more flexible, but the ability to get back like 2 3-drops for 3 mana would have been really powerful.
Yeah, that would have been significantly more powerful. And I'll admit, like, there are times where this card is not going to be powerful. I envision it more as like a Orzhov grindy card than like a Boros kind of like build the board back up card, because like your Blood Artists and stuff all sit at 2 mana, so there are times where you're like, okay, get back Ellis Ilkor, get back Blood Artist, and get back another 2-drop, and that's kind of busted. But yeah, that might not be the use case for the card, so we'll see where it lands. I would like to try the card out. I'm skeptical of gift. Like, it might just be that it's incorrect to gift pretty much always unless you're winning the turn that you're gifting, but we'll see. We haven't played with the mechanic yet, so it's a little hard to figure out what the use cases on these gift cards is going to be.
Speaking of gift, so the next one is Crumb and Get It. It's a single white mana for an instant. You gift a food, so we give our opponent a food, and target creature you control gets +2/+2, and if a gift was promised, that creature gains indestructible until end of turn. So this is the kind of just on-the-nose, really awkward puns that a lot of the community either loves or hates. I think this card's pretty good, though. I think gifting a food is relatively minor for what you're getting out of it, which is being able to use this as a protection spell or to straight up win an even combat. So, I mean, I think giving your opponent a food isn't free, right? Because there's a lot of decks that can do things with the food, but a good portion of the time they're just going to sack it and gain 3 life, and you'll have blanked a removal spell or won a combat or something like that. And so I think this will be pretty decent. I think we're gonna replace Take Up the Shield with it, and just the efficiency on that should be enough, because we've seen with Tyvar's Stand that being 1 mana is very, very important for this kind of effect.
Yeah, this is what I'm calling an efficient role player, right? Most combat tricks just fall into the role player category, right? They'll help you win a combat or like blank a removal spell or something like that. And this gets the efficient modifier because it is just 1 mana as opposed to a lot of 2 mana combat tricks that do similar things. I expect this to be good. Again, with the gift thing, it remains to be seen, like, how bad is it to give your opponent just like a game object, even if it sounds like, oh, I can just give them a food. Like, will it come back and bite us if we're just giving our opponents food, at every opportunity? Like, I'm sure that adds up if you do it too much. Maybe on 1 card it's just fine, but it reminds me a lot of something like Invigorate, like give your opponent 4 life and then give your creature +4/+4 for no mana. But of course, like, giving them a game object's a little bit different. So again, plus, like, I swear to God, the bat in this art is just holding like a gigantic Taki or like a Subway sandwich or something. I didn't realize like it's like a baguette or something, but it just looks like a giant Taki to me.
Yeah, it's definitely weird. I do think the gift too, if gift ends up being really bad, like if gifting a food is really bad for you, this card is impacted more than like Dewdrop Cure, where Dewdrop Cure, we're putting it in with like the gift being extra as opposed to why you're playing the card. Whereas I think here, the Indestructible is why we're putting this in the cube.
Yeah, though, I mean, like, obviously you wouldn't play 1 mana +2/+2, like small giant growth with no upside. Though, if that was just floating around a cube, a lot of times it would be enough to like win a combat. So what you're expecting here is to have to give your creature indestructible. But the baseline of like sometimes just white mana +2/+2 is enough, and you don't have to gift that food. But I'm assuming you are putting this card in your deck with the intentions of using the gift mode of the card. With that being said, we can move on to Hop to It. Pretty straightforward card. This is 2 and a white for a sorcery at uncommon, and it makes 3 1/1 white rabbit creature tokens. So kind of like a Hordling Outburst, and I think a better color for this effect, and also just easier to cast. I think Hordling Outburst is 1 red. So 3 mana for 3 tokens is just, I think, a rock solid card. This is what I'm rating as a bridge card because it has actual synergy in different types of decks. Obviously, it screams like Greenlight Selesnya tokens. It makes a bunch of tokens, but these are also the type of cards that you can sometimes slot into like your Orzhov Sacrifice decks or your Boros aggro decks with like heroic reinforcements and stuff like that. So I do like that this is a card that's like kind of explicitly for a token deck, but has play in a bunch of other decks as well.
Yeah, really good follow up to Rosie Cotton as well.
Yeah, are we with this set? Are we getting rid of Rosie Cotton yet?
I refuse to answer this question at the moment.
Rosie Cotton is like, can you imagine you have to gift your opponent a food and they just have Rosie Cotton in play? It's like, oh, okay.
Oh my God. Yeah, Rosie is a really powerful card that I feel like is always sort of on the fence of being kind of cut, but it's just so much fun to play.
It is. It's one of the most fun cards in the cube, but it's also coincidentally like in the top 5 most powerful cards in the cube because of cards like Hop to It. Like you go this into Rosie Cotton into Hop to It, you get to distribute 3 +1/+1 counters. Like at the very worst, that just puts 3 2/2s on board, which is pretty strong. So, and that's just like a bunch of normal cards. You don't even have to like jump through hoops for anything there. So we probably have to have the Rosie Cotton discussion at some point, but I think I agree. We just keep pushing that off until our members quit.
Yeah, when they break out the pitchforks and the torches, we can talk about it.
Yeah, that hasn't happened quite yet. Just the pitchforks, but once the torches come out, that's when we should talk. I wanted to wrap up white with 2 random cards that aren't really like considerations for cube. I just wanted to mention something about them each real quick. The first is Banishing Light, which is a reprint. It's 2 and a white for an enchantment. When it enters, you exile a non-land permanent until it leaves the battlefield. Kind of like the standard, O-ring type effect. I wanted to mention it because it's common for the first time. It's been reprinted 5, 6, 7 times or something like that, and it's common for the first time, which is probably not like that big of a deal. We do actually get effects like this at common pretty regularly, but A, that does affect pauper cubes, which is not something we talk about very much. And B, it's probably like maybe an indication that we'll get more pushed versions of Banishing Light in the future, which I think they've been working on. And I would like to see some more pushed like permanent exile Oblivion Ring type effects in the future. So that's promising to see this at common. And then the other white card I wanted to mention is just because I think it's hilarious. It's this card called Jolly Gerbils. It's one. It doesn't even matter what the stats are. It's 1 in a white for a 2/3. But the rules text on this card says whenever you give a gift, draw a card. Which, like, obviously, if you're like reading Bloomburrow cards, you're like, okay, the gift mechanic. But can you imagine being like a new player who's never really seen Magic cards, like riffling through like bulk bins and stuff, and you pull this card out, and it's like, when you give a gift, draw a card? Like, what does that mean? What is giving a gift? Like, I go buy my opponent a soda and I get to draw a card?
Yeah, this is, as you said, this is some unhinged rule text. It's actually, I think, a decent card. And man, they really nailed the flavor on this set, because this is some of the most wholesome flavor text I think I've read in a minute. This is just a very, very wholesome set. It brought a lot of joy in what's been an increasingly either goofy or, like... I
mean, we go straight from this set into Duskmorn, where we're chainsawing people and stuff like that, so...
yeah, a lot of tonal whiplash going on, but Bloomburrow's just they managed to make it feel like they were taking a Magic set inspired by something instead of just really copying something. And I've seen that sentiment a lot.
Yeah, that does it for white. Not that much to talk about in white. We've got blue up next with a card that I believe we'll have talked about already for the mainline queue, because we're excited about it just in general. This is Plume Creed Escort. 1 in a blue for a 2/1 uncommon bird scout with flash, flying, and when it enters, target creature you control gains hexproof until end of turn. This is one of the very few cards from this set that I labeled as a possible forever card, which is the label we give to a card that we know we are going to play, and it's going to take something very, very strong to have us cut it, or the card has to be too strong itself, which this one's like obviously not going to be too strong, but I do have this labeled as a forever card. I'm curious what you think of that.
Yeah, I think I had 3 cards labeled as forever cards in this set, and this is one of them. This card's really good. Zephyr Sentinel's already a powerful card in the cube. It's a card that doesn't even all that often end up buying back ETBs. It's used for the same thing that this will be used for, except this doesn't require you to recast your card. So in a lot of spots, it's just going to be a better Zephyr Sentinel. That means that the two of them together are going to be sitting in the cube, and it is going to be super annoying when your opponent has 1 blue open to point a removal spell at something.
Yeah, it also, in the mainline cube, we have this thing with our 2-drops, especially in blue, where we prefer to have them have flash if possible. Like, the more of them you have with flash, the better they all get, because they all play together better. And I think we're getting to
game.
Yeah, exactly. We're getting to a point with the Peasant Cube where we can do something similar. Not quite enough. The one knock against this card is that, like, it doesn't scream that it's for any particular deck, and the Peasant Cube is very archetype driven. But I think you could just slot this into any blue deck that's really not like blue black, but even then you might play it some amount of the time if you have important creatures to protect and stuff like that. So yeah. Very well-rounded card, and surprised to see them push this effect on an uncommon, because, what the previous version of this was like Rattle Chains or something like that.
Yeah, just really a sign of the times. This card's very, very pushed. They could have printed this at rare in some sets, and I wouldn't have thought too much of it.
Yeah. Okay, the next one is an interesting one to talk about, because I'm not sure I'm sold on it yet, despite it reading like it's just like a must-play card or something like that. So we have Daring Wave Rider here. This is 2 blue for a 4/4 uncommon Otter Wizard. When it enters, you can cast an instant or sorcery with mana value 4 or less from your graveyard without paying its mana cost, and it exiles it if it goes to your graveyard again. So kind of like a free flashback of a cheap to medium cost spell on top of a 4/4. No keyword or anything, nothing beyond that. Just 4 mana 4/4, come down, cast a spell from your graveyard, and then move on with your life.
And the 6 mana 4/4 kill a thing is becoming my favorite card template.
Yeah, we're going to talk about another 6-drop like Necrotal tier 2 when we get to black, but I think. So the immediate comparison that comes to mind is Skoa Ember Mage, which we just got with the last set. That's the grandeur, like 6 mana 4/4, come down and deal 4 to something. And that obviously can go to face, so I think it's a little better than the Wave Rider on average, but Wave Rider has higher upside. The thing that, like, kind of pushed me down on it a little bit, And I have this labeled as an archetypal, like, quote-unquote fun of card, like a card we would play that I think is just fun to play, but I'm not sure it actually, like, belongs in the cube long-term. The thing that pushed me down on it is, like, it's a blue card that's really heavily relying on the other color in your deck, I think, to support it. Because, like, what you want at baseline is to be able to flashback, like, a Doomblade or a red burn spell and kill a creature. You want this to be, like, 6 mana, get a creature off board. And it doesn't work with counterspells, which is a really large portion of blue. But as you pointed out when we talked about it, you can occasionally, like, play this and hit something like Out Cold or Behold the Multiverse to make this, like, a 6 mana Mole Drifter, like an actual straight-up Mole Drifter. And that's probably just good enough. So there's probably enough flexibility and the card will hit often enough that it's just good. But I am, like, a little skeptical of how good in blue a 6 mana 4/4 come down and kill a creature is. And it's way worse if you have to, like, flashback, like, Fate and Hope and just bounce a creature. Maybe Repulse is okay, but I wonder what the average case for this card is going to be. And, like, if it misses any amount of the time, because, like, it could just miss. Like, you might just not have a castable spell in your graveyard. Seems unlikely, but it is a possibility here.
This is all true. I mean, it is a cool card that I think is going to have some interesting things you can do with it. Like, all these Snapcastery mage type cards are really fun. But my biggest point would be, this is a really, really adorable card. Like, have you looked at this art? How could you say no to that?
Yeah. I told Teld he gets to do that on one card from this set. Like, you can't puppy eyes me on, like, every single otter in this set and be like, yeah, but look at the otter. He's riding a clamshell. It's like, yeah. You said that for the last 2 otters. I mean, do you think this card is just regularly going to be good? Like you should assume when you put it in your deck that it's going to do something good and just, like, not even assume that it's going to miss, because it probably shouldn't miss that often if you're, like, building your deck with any sensibility to it.
Yeah, like, how often do you put Slick Shot Lockpicker in your deck and then miss? I guess would be my question, right? Yeah. And I think the answer to that is, like, very rarely. So I would guess that most of the time this is going to hit something good. I think the biggest weaknesses this card's going to run into is that some of the best cards that you can flashback, that, granted, Slick Shot doesn't always do this, but cards like Imperial Oath, Rise from the Tides, these 5/6 drop, really expensive spells, you can't re-flashback those, which is a little concerning, I guess. But there's a lot you're going to be able to do with this, and I actually could see this having some flexibility and redundancy, if you have any sort of mill or anything like that in your deck to, I don't know. It's one of those cards that's really, really hard to think that it's going to be bad, but it might be that it doesn't end up doing, because, like, I immediately, when I read these kind of cards, jump into Magic Christmas Land of all the sweet things that we can flash back. And that isn't really how games play out. Games play out a little bit differently, where you kind of have to take what you've got in your graveyard. But I think most of the time this card's going to hit and it's going to play something decent. I do agree with you that it's pretty reliant, I think, most of the time on playing somewhere in the Grixis space. I don't think you're going to want this in your blue-green deck, for example.
Yeah.
Or, you're necessarily even your blue-white deck. So I think there's a little bit of limitation to it, but I think if you're in that space, it is kind of good, I guess. But I will say the other downside potentially is that we have Skoa. There's a 6-drop in black we're going to talk about, and a 6-drop in blue. And I think the decks that want all 3 of those cards share a lot of similar space.
Yeah, that's another thing where it's like, if you're playing cards like Ravenous Chupacabra and the use case for this card is 6 mana kill a creature, like, is it really worth a 6-drop in blue? Like, if we had Flame Tongue Kavu in our cube and stuff like that, like, I don't know. It feels like it rubs up against all the other versions, and it's in a color where that effect is maybe at its worst for a lot of the different, like, blue-based archetypes. But I'm not sure. Like, again, you can just flashback, like, a Behold the Multiverse, and that's an excellent card. So I guess you just have to be intentional about the spells that you put in your deck. Like, you probably want a mix of hard removal with, like, card advantage and stuff like that, just so that, like, you have options when it comes down.
Yeah, I think that's going to be the case, is you're going to want to have a wide variety. You are going to want to be in a spells deck, and, like, because some percentage of the time, I agree with you. I think some percentage of the time you need to be able to hit, a Chart a Course or an Out Cold or a Behold the Multiverse or some sort of powerful blue spell or powerful card draw spell, Lively Dirge, something like that. I guess Lively Dirge wouldn't work, my bad. Blood for Bones would. But so you need to be able to hit something powerful from time to time.
Speaking of Blood for Bones, the last thing I wanted to mention with this card is that there's like some mini combo potential depending on how like you've built out your cube, especially with like the blink spells that draw a card when they blink a creature. So there's things like Blur and Acrobatic Maneuver, which are 3 mana, blink a creature, and then draw a card. And some people, like, I could conceive of a cube where you're really explicitly supporting that sort of game plan, and you play Wave Rider, you cast, like, Acrobatic Maneuver, you blink Wave Rider, you draw a card, and then Wave Rider comes back in, cast Blur from your graveyard, you draw a card, you blink it out, it comes back in, you cast the new, like, Splash Portal card, blink it out, draw a card, like, you just kind of go off with all the blink spells that replace themselves. Yeah, reanimation, like Blood for Bones as well, is usually pretty good with effects like this, because it just, like, gives you something else on top of the spell that you're casting, so we'll see where it lands and what kind of decks are playing it, and if it ends up being just a blue X spell deck and, like, card and nothing else, it's probably not worth it on top of all the other, like, top-end blue spells-based, payoffs we have, but we'll see. Let's play the card and see where it lands, and, I am excited to play. I do love Snapcaster Mages.
We've got Splash Lasher next, and it's 3 in a blue for a 3/3. It's a Frog Wizard, and it's got Offspring for 1 in a blue. And when it enters, you tap up to 1 target creature and put a stun counter on it. So this we are pretty interested in. It's a pretty powerful tempo card, I think. Like, if you just play this as is, 4 mana 3/3, tap a thing, stun counter it it's fine, but I think the Offspring really pushes this over the edge, where this is going to create a really powerful board presence. It's going to give you a lot of time in order to either kill your opponent or big fish them if you're in kind of a close matchup.
Mm-hmm. I am excited for this. This is another test card, like just a straight up test card, because I'm not sure it's actually like amazing. I'm sure in the limited format it's going to be like this fantastic card, but for our cube, I'm like, is it really better than just using your 4-drop slot on like Mist Raven or whatever? I'm not sure, because Frost Lynxes tend to be worse than like Mana Wars in cube. Not always because of the whole like ETB dynamic, but I am interested. I will say, when I added this card to the list originally, I was kind of like erroneously thinking of Offspring as just making an additional copy of the creature. So I was like, oh, 2 3/3s for 6 mana. Like, that's not how it works. It makes a 1/1 copy. So you're getting 4 power and toughness on board and locking 2 creatures down. But if you're in any sort of deck that can leverage that for a good attack, and then the next turn, like, you're attacking as well, it's kind of like a sleep that just put 2 bodies on board, and then, like, killing the creatures doesn't really matter. Like, yeah, you kill my Offspring token, that's great. I'm still going to hit you with the 3/3 or whatever. So it's just a nice little top-end card. I'm not sure it's actually good enough as a 4-drop, but, like, you're usually holding off on the sleep type effects till as late as possible anyway. And I could see this being, like, a Simic top-end card, which is surprising for a blue creature. So I think there's a lot of potential here. I will say, if you have Proliferate synergies in your cube, this card goes way, way, way up, because you can proliferate stun counters. Mop's, Peasant Proliferate cube probably plays this, and then you go like Splash Lasher, Offspring it, tap 2 things down, hit you with my Thrumming Bird, proliferate the stun counters, and at that point you're just kind of like killing 2 creatures. I don't think it's not going to play that really way powerful for us. Yeah, it's not going to play that way for us, because we don't do the whole proliferate thing. But yeah, I'm excited to try out this card, but I will say I'm not like if somebody in the community came up and said, why do you think Splash Lasher is that good? I think it sucks. I'd be like, you might be right. Like, I'm not 100% sure. We'll have to play the card to find out.
Yeah, I think I agree with you. This is the rare case of a blue creature who I think's best home is going to be in some sort of green deck. Yeah,
which is appropriate for the frogs, right? it makes sense.
Yeah.
Slam dunk card coming up here. We've got Eddie Merc Crab, 5 blue for a 5/5 uncommon elemental crab with flash. It costs 1 generic mana less to cast for each instant and sorcery in your graveyard. It enters the battlefield tapped if it's not your turn. And when it enters, tap up to 2 target creatures. So 7 mana 5/5. You can get it down to just blue if you have up to 5 instants and sorceries in your graveyard. And it does have flash, taps 2 creatures when it enters, but you can't like ambush in combat and eat something, because the crab itself will enter tapped if you cast it on an opponent's turn. So another one of these like Tolarian Terror, Cryptic Serpent type cards, which are kind of like the backbone, cards of our spell-based decks, and leads me to believe this should just be an excellent card. I didn't mark it as a forever card, I don't know where you land on that. I marked it as an archetypal card because it's very obviously just like, oh, spells matters, these cards are usually pretty straightforward, but I'm curious where you think this lands. We're definitely going to play it. I think it'll be good, but I'm not sure if it meets that forever card territory for me.
Yeah, I think this is, my gut instinct is this is worse than Tolarian Terror, but still very good. But the problem is, if it's worse than Tolarian Terror, I'm not going to say it's a forever card. I think this is outside of that category for me too, of like, I could see us getting a better version of this or replacing it for some other effect down the road, but this seems really good. The lack of flash, or the lack of coming into play untapped when you flash it in, Lockwell in the main cube does the same thing, and that just doesn't really matter. Lockwell's still really good. Obviously, it comes with an adventure, but that aside, this also, when you cast it, will tap down 2 blockers. So really, even though you don't get to ambush something, you do get to either stop 2 things from attacking or really open up your opponent's board for you to attack on your next turn when you're 5/5 untapped. So I could see this card being really, really oppressive. Actually, it feels like once you're, like if you're playing the Is It deck and you're ahead and your opponent is just on the back foot really hard, I could see this being the kind of card that just kind of creates those like unbeatable turns where your opponent, no matter what they do, you're just going to tap down the 2 best things, you're going to untap, and then you're going to cast a spell, swing with everything, and kill them.
Yeah, I mean, it should just be good. Like you said, like it reads like that's a huge downside that it can't like eat your opponent's creature in combat and remove something from the board, but like I guess that is a downside to some extent, but the fact that it does tap down 2 creatures means that you're getting kind of the effect you want of like not getting hit by a creature. You're getting 2 blockers down. So the turn you cast this, you should probably not be taking combat damage, which is really nice and kind of makes up for the fact that like, oh, this is tapped. I can't eat your 3/3 in combat or anything like that. So this card will perform well. I'm confident the card will perform well. It's just a matter of like if we keep getting more Tolarian Terror type cards, like how many is too many, and which ones are better than the others. So for now, we'll try this card out and we'll report back on how it does. Why don't you take these next 2, because these were cards that you suggested talking about.
Sure. So the first one is Shoreline Looter. So it's 1 and a blue for a 1/1. It cannot be blocked. And whenever it deals combat damage to a player, you draw a card. And then if you have Threshold, which is if there are 7 or more cards in your graveyard, you don't have to discard a card. So it is early in the game, will be a looter. And later the game turns into just a straight up draw engine. There's no real synergies going on with this card in our cube at the moment. But there was a time where Looter Ilkor was vintage cube playable, and I know that was a long time ago. But like, there was a time where these kind of cards were just super premium, and I think this might be the best version of this effect, of the like Merfolk Looter adjacent, because this card not being able to be blocked at all means that it's a great place to put a Bone Splitter or counters, any sort of stat combat buffs, Curious Obsession type cards if you're into those sort of things. But on top of that, I think just being able to smooth out your draw, get in some chip damage, and then start actually gaining you card advantage is a pretty cool use of the space. I don't know if there's a deck in our cube that's going to be super interested in this, because you can't really take advantage of the chip damage, I don't think, with a lot of our blue archetypes. Outside of maybe Is It, but then Is It really wants its creatures to have prowess. So there is a bit of push and pull there. But it's just a really nifty card. I think it's the most powerful version of this effect. We saw the Midnight Hunt Werewolf as well, and I think this is better.
Uncommon, you mean like below rare, right? Like this.
No, I think this is better than the rare Midnight Hunt one.
Yeah. But you mean like it's not better than like Malcolm or and stuff like that.
Oh, sure. Sorry. Yeah. I forgot about. Yeah. You're 100%.
It's funny because like there was this period of time where like Merfolk Looter was still being played in like 2019, 2020, and I always went on record saying Merfolk Looter is not a good card anymore. Like cards are just better than that. And then they came out with Suspicious Stowaway and Midnight Hunt, and it was like, oh, this is what looters look like now. It was like, oh, Looter Core, this card that we've been playing in Vintage Cube forever, is obsolete now. And then, like, immediately after that, every set for the next 2 years, they're like, here's another great looter, and here's another great looter, and here's Kitsa, the Otterball Elite that we talked about in the other episode. Like, they just keep going up and up and up, and now we're seeing that trickle down to, like, lower rarities, where this is a card that formerly would have been a rare, and just kind of like it's an uncommon that does the Looter Ilkor thing. So that's kind of cool. I think you have it labeled here as a test card because we are going to try it out. I think if it has a real home, it's going to be blue-black, because blue-black really does want to turbo out its graveyard for like this Eddie Merc Crab we talked about, and Rise of the Dark Realm, or not Rise of the Dark Realms, Rise from the Tides and stuff like that. Mouth of Sauron. It is a little awkward that it's not a spell, but at some point this does just become 2 mana, 1/1 draw a card when it hits your opponent, and that's fine. And then, some people do still play ninjas, and like this is just a good ninja enabler. So there's probably enough here to make it like a generically good blue card that won't always make the cut in different decks, but probably makes the cut in some number of decks, and that's enough to like be like, okay, let's try it out.
Yeah, I also feel like this could be a decent Simic card, despite not looking like it at first, just because one of the ways that deck loses is flooding out and just not finding gas. So this is going to be the kind of card that helps smooth out their early draws a little bit. Probably not, but I think you're probably right that blue-black is going to be its best home if it has one. So we'll see. So the next one is just a brief mention. It is Thought Shucker. It's 1 in a blue for a 1/3 rat rogue with Threshold for 1 in a blue. Put a +1 counter on it. Draw a card. Activate only if there are 7 or more cards in your graveyard, and activate only once. This is just literally an alchemy card. I just like to point this out that for the Magic boomers who are like alchemy, is ruining the game or whatever. And don't be wrong, I've come around on alchemy hating a lot. I'm definitely there, but we get those in paper too.
They've made a conscious effort lately to like take the alchemy only mechanics and like actually make paper versions of them. And that like activate only once thing, like once ever, that's been used like in the past, but like that's a perfectly doable thing in paper. Like look at Thought Shucker. Is anyone like, oh, Thought Shucker, like why isn't that a digital only card? It's so hard to track. It's like, no, it's not. No, it's not. We can remember activate only once. You'll be fine. But yeah, wait until we get to Duskmorn and we talk about the your opponent can't gain life for the rest of the game card.
I'm sure that won't be a tracking nightmare.
No, not at all. Not at all. Okay, we got, I think, 2 more blue cards here, some spells to talk about. First is Spellgyre. 2 blue for an uncommon instant. Choose 1, counter target spell, or surveil 2, then draw 2 cards. This is a Eenie Cube fodder here for sure, but I've got this marked as a flexible test card. Anything with modality is going to get the flexible tag. And then test card, because like I think you and I both agree it's like really not that good of a card, despite reading like it has this insane modality. But 4-mana counter spell, I don't care what the other mode is. When you actually have to counter something for 4 mana and that's all the card does, that's just not good. I don't care if it has modality on it, because you don't get the rest of the modality when you actually have to choose that mode, and you are forced into choosing that mode a lot, right? Like you put this in primarily as a counter spell probably. And then the other mode, surveil 2, then draw 2. Like I think that's fine, especially if you're in a deck that cares about filling up its graveyard. But we have had spells in the past like Scattered Thoughts that are like, look at the top 4, put 2 in your graveyard, put 2 in your hand, which I think is just better than what this card does. Maybe it's the like same exact effect and I'm just being stupid about it, but I'm not super excited about this. I think we're going to test it. Obviously, it's got the test card tag, and I think we were going to talk about it for the mainline cube and just decided not to because we all decided it's just not that good. But this is what you have defined as like bad modality, right?
Yeah, so I will say I don't have this on the I did the first recordings for the update video today, and we didn't have this on here. We decided not to play it based on what I've got. That being said, yeah, this is like classic bad modality. You've talked a lot before, and I think I fell prey to this a lot in the past until you started pointing it out. That modality is really only good if the options that you get have a mode that you really want to click. So, if you don't have a button on the choices that you're given that is just like the default really good one, or multiple ones that are good enough, right? That make the flexibility of the card outweigh everything. You end up with cards like this where 4-mana counter target spell, like if you just play Dismiss, you get to draw a card on top of that, and it's great. If you play 4 mana, you get, for the draw effect, you can play Behold the Multiverse and split the effect up into 2 pieces. So neither of these effects are good enough, I think, to make me want to spend 4 mana. And in fact, I think 4 mana just counter target spell with no upside whatsoever is just really, really bad. I think they could have slapped Surveil 1 or 2 onto the counter target spell mode of this card, and it would still be like not crazy. It would be better, and we would be having a different conversation, I think. But I think they really should have slapped Surveil 1 or 2 onto the counterspell mode of this card.
Yeah, this feels like the type of modal counterspell for like that you put in a deck that you assume you're always in control of the game. Like then you actually, like, what you want to do is fire this off for Surveil 2, Draw 2, but you're going to be priced into firing it off for counter target spell probably 75% of the time, if not more, and that's just not a good counter spell. That's just not good. Like it's a lot like what's that one from AFR, You Find the Villain's Lair or whatever, where it's like 3 mana counter a spell or 3 mana draw 2 discard 2. Like first off, or draw 2 discard 1 or whatever. Like first off, that draw mode's not even that good, but also like the counterspell mode's not that good. Like I think people have this, and I don't know what the conversation is around this card. Maybe it even sees like constructed play. I don't know, but like I think people have this like weird mentality thing where they see modality on the card and they like incorrectly assume they're getting some amount of both modes when they actually cast the card, and that's just not true, right? Like you have to pick one. If you use this as a counterspell, you erase all of the rest of the text on it. And like I understand, you know, having these two effects occupy one card is the upside, but neither effect is really that strong when you actually cast it. I guess if you're still in your cube on like Glimmer of Genius and things like that, like you could probably upgrade to this, because this is just way better than Glimmer of Genius if you don't care about energy. But I would then ask, like, why are you still on Glimmer of Genius? We've made these 4 mana draw 2s so good recently that like you don't have to play the bad ones.
Yeah. I mean, like I said, in our environment, I still think I'd rather have Ball the Multiverse, and just like be able to split payment on that one is really, really nice. I don't know. This is a card that I wanted to like when I first read it, but it just this just was a little too expensive for a counter spell. It's not quite impactful enough for a draw spell. Yeah,
I mean, Dismiss isn't even like a must-play card. Like, you could build a control deck and just not put Dismiss in it some amount of the time.
Yeah, I mean, Dismiss is still great, but yeah, you don't. It's not a required card or anything. Sure.
Yeah. What do you have here for the last one for blue?
I just had Honorball Antics, which we've talked about this one, and I think I was kind of falling into the dream of getting to flash this back. So this is a 1 and a blue. For a sorcery, create a 1/1 blue and red otter creature token with prowess. If the spell is cast from anywhere other than your hand, you put a +1 counter on that creature. So it has flashback for 3 and a blue. It's an innate 2-for-1 technically. It triggers and benefits from spell casts. But ultimately where we landed was it's just not quite efficient enough. Like neither token are a real body for what you're spending the mana on. And I think that's the case with all of I guess there's only 2 of them, but the cards that make prowess otter tokens just all kind of have this effect where they just don't quite do enough for the mana that you're spending. And I think that's actually true of blue-red. It felt like in general in this set was really overcosted.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it feels like every single otter is like 1/1 worth of stats lower than what you would think. And maybe that's just smart design. Like, maybe it just comes out to be the super powerful deck because prowess does stack, you know? But I do think this is just below rate. I didn't actually even know that you got the +1/+1 counter if you cast it. I didn't realize that was part of the card, but it still doesn't sway me that much. Like, 2/2 prowess for 4 is not really that much better than a 1/1 prowess for 4. Like, it's better, but it's not that much better. I guess the thing to do with this card to make it exciting is to play it with effects that can cast it from your graveyard without actually having to use the flashback. Like, there aren't really that many. But
like Daring Wave Rider.
Yeah, Darren Wave Rider, Slick Shot, Lockpicker, right? Lets you cast this for 2 mana from your graveyard, and you still get the 2/2 prowess. There's things like, what is it, Fountain of the Third Path can let you cast a 2-drop spell from your graveyard, and like you don't have to use the flashback ability to get the 2/2, but even then, it's just not that much of a reward for being like, haha, I cast it for 2 instead of for 4. It's like, okay.
Oh, you know what this card is actually good is with Impulse Draw.
Impulse Draw, how so?
Because if it's cast from anywhere other than your hand, so when you exile them from the top of your library, you'll be playing them
impulsive draw. Yeah. I was thinking like actual casting the spell impulse. I was like, how's that?
Oh no, sorry. whatever we're calling the exile, the top card of your library.
No, you're right. It's impulse draw or impulsive draw. I just immediately went to the card impulse, and I was like, I don't understand how that works, but.
But even then, it's still not that good, right?
No.
You're just...
This can't occupy a cube slot over, like, unless you just want the otters. Like, if you want the otters, go for it. But outside of that, like, I don't think it's good enough.
Yeah, since we're not testing this card, I will point out they are really cute.
Yeah, the otters are cute, yes. The squirrels, though. The squirrels are cute, too, right? So black has my favorite card in the set, the one card that's going to get me in a lot of trouble for the retail limited format, and I've asked people to talk me off the ledge, and they have, and I'm still up on the ledge somehow. But this first card in black is called Bone Cache Overseer. It's a single black mana for a 1/1 uncommon squirrel warlock. It's an outlaw. Tap it, pay 1 life, draw a card. That's pretty good. That's a pretty good card right there.
Is there a catch?
Yeah. Okay. So activate only if 3 or more cards left your graveyard this turn, or if you've sacrificed a food this turn. So in other words, if you foraged this turn. That, man, first off, I have this flagged as a hashtag not for us card, which we don't talk about that many of them here, but not for us cards are cards that, like, they're probably broken in somebody's cube if you did a lot of work to make them broken, but they probably just don't work in our cube, which is really sad because I want this card to be good. Like, a 1-mana 1/1 tap, draw a card is obviously an insane card, but you just don't get to do the thing every turn. And I think the thing you need to make it a broken card is, like, an actual food theme in your cube, so that, like, you sack a food, draw a card, sack a food, draw a card, forage, draw a card. Because, like, even if you're a turbo graveyard deck, like, how often are you getting chunks of 3 in your graveyard, and how often are you able to actually remove 3 cards from your graveyard at one time? There are ways to do it, right? Like, you can escape. You can even go roundabout with, like, Rotten Reunion, my own thing, and then cast Rotten Reunion, which is a lot of work to make it work. But I just want to love this card because it's such a powerful text box, but I don't think it actually works, unfortunately.
Yeah, I will say green-black food is something that I think we're getting to the density that you could make it an archetype in your cube and it'd be good. It would have cross synergy with, like, sack decks where you're sacrificing game objects, and it would have some crossplay with, like, artifact or enchantment synergies or I guess just artifact synergies in other colors. So I think you could actually do that. You know, we've got Greta, Gingerbread Hunter. There's the green-black signpost out of this set. So I think if that's something you're looking to do, I do think we're getting to the density even just on the arena client that you could do that. And I think if you do that, I do think this card's really powerful. I actually think this is, you have it tagged on here as a potential red flag card. And I actually think this card, if you are truly enabling it and, like, it's just 1 mana, like, even if it's every other turn you draw a card, that's got to be pretty broken, right?
Yeah. You know what it reminds me of is that Theros Beyond Death 1-drop in black, Hateful Eidolon, I think is the name of the card.
Yeah, so I'm playing Constructed for a while.
Yeah, it draws you a card whenever an aura attached to a creature, or whenever a creature dies and it had an aura of yours attached to it, you draw a card, and it's like, okay, 1-drop, you have to build an entire deck to make it work. Things have to kind of go in a certain way. So, like, there's all this setup to it, and then your creature is also just like a 1-mana dork that can die to anything. So, like, you put through all this work to make your card like this broken 1-drop, and then they just kill it, and your plan is kind of like kaput, you know? So,
yeah, I will say I think the barrier to entry for a card like this is a lot lower because all the cards that make food are just generically good cards.
Sure.
And black, especially like the mid-range black deck that this would want to be played in, is going to have a bunch of recursion itself. This is a great thing to hit back with, like, Lively Dirge. Unfortunately, Lively Dirge doesn't quite, like, trigger this, right? Because you either get 2 cards out or you bring this back and it doesn't have haste or whatever. But, like, there's, you know, even that beyond that, I think the recursion in black and the ease at which you could just, like, crack a food, gain 3 life, pay a life, draw a card, like, I think if you're supporting food, this is a really, really powerful engine card. And I think if you aren't doing that, this card is basically has no text box.
Yeah, which is a shame because it's, like, easily my favorite card from this set. It's just like it gets the wheels turning, and I like cards like that. And it's an uncommon, like, easily could have seen them slapping a rare symbol on this and making it a 1/2 or something like that. But
well, you should come play the standard cube because green-black food continues to be one of the archetypes in that cube after the update, and we're definitely including this one, I think.
Well, I might make it out to that just for this card, but nobody I need the promise that nobody else is going to take it from me. So.
Yeah, we'll just we'll rig the pack so that you get to pack 1, pick 1 it.
Oh, perfect. Just keep refreshing until keep pulling a Doug until I get this card in my opening pack. Okay, so that's my favorite card from the set that unfortunately is not going to make our queue, but we should talk about it. The next one is I've got this pegged as a forever card. Yep. It is Thought Stalker Warlock. It's 2 and a black for a 2/2 uncommon lizard warlock. It has Menace, 3 mana 2/2 Menace. When it enters, choose target opponent. If they lost life this turn, they reveal their hand and you choose a non-land card and they discard it. Otherwise, they just discard a card. So baseline 3-mana 2/2 menace like Virus Beetle, they discard a card. And if you've pecked in damage or they've lost any life at all from anything, it actually becomes a straight up Thoughtseize. Seems amazing
this is
to me.
Definitely a forever card, right? Like this is the kind of card that is just hard to imagine unless they just strictly print a better version of it leaving the cube. We're replacing a card that does something similar that I think this is better in most cases.
Yeah, I mean, this card would be good enough, I think. Like, good enough, not like forever card, if it was just 3-mana 2/2 menace Virus Beetle. It still probably would be good enough if it only had the Thoughtseize mode and you had to deal damage to get a card from your opponent. But the fact that, like, it just has the fallback of your opponent, like straight up 2 for 1, and then like the upside being as good as it is, like straight up Thoughtseize your opponent. That's really high upside on a body that I think is reasonable. Like 3-mana 2/2 menace isn't like crazy, but 3-mana 2/2 menace on top of like strip your best card from your hand, that's pretty good.
Yeah, and it needs to be mentioned that because this is a creature, there's going to be times where you get to do this multiple times over the course of a game and really just put pressure your opponent's hand. One interesting thing that I was thinking is if you know your opponent has no spells in their hand for whatever reason, it's actually a negative for them to have lost life, right? Because they would still have to discard a land if you just played this out.
That's kind of
funny.
So
a little bit of a weirdness there, but other than that, I mean, this card looks really, really powerful.
Forever card territory, which again, forever card doesn't mean there's no conceivable way we could cut the card. It just means like, oh yeah, that one's in. Like we're making room for that one and it's sticking around for a while. Here's an interesting one. Husk Burster Swarm is 7 and a black for a 6/6 uncommon elemental insect. It costs 1 less to cast for each creature you own in exile and in your graveyard, and it has menace and death touch. So we flirted around a little bit with Writhing Necromass from DMU that I believe was like 7 mana for a 5/5 death touch with the like cost 1 less for each creature in your graveyard. It was just okay. I think it was a fine little payoff for doing like a turbo mill thing in Golgari, but it was just an okay little payoff. This seems like a significant upgrade to that.
Well, you missed the middle of the story where OTJ came out and we got this little card called Hollow Marauder.
Yeah.
And there was much weeping and gnashing of teeth.
Hollow Marauder, if you are a Peasant Cube designer working in even like a semi-similar space to what we're working with, and you have passed over Hollow Marauder, I suggest you go back and pick that card up because we've gotten to the point where we think it's too good. Where we're actually going to play Husk Burster Swarm instead of Hollow Marauder because we feel like we should remove Hollow Marauder from our cube. That's how good the card has been.
Yeah, it's like most of the time what ends up happening is the first time you cast it, if it wasn't in, it'll be like a 2 or a 3 mana and it's like a 4/2, 3 for 1. And sometimes it costs more, but usually you're not paying more than 4 mana by the time you get to the point where you want to cast it. But then you recur it.
Yes.
And then, or you top deck it and it's like just 1 mana, 4/2 flyer, 3 for 1. And then you pick it up and then you 3 for 1 them. Then you pick it up, then you 3 for 1 them. And your opponent just runs out of cards and you just keep drawing cards and it's also evasive. The card's very, very silly.
And it fulfills the conditions on Kozilek's Unsealing and Up the Beanstalk, but you usually only cast it for like 1 or 2 mana, which is crazy. I know people love those cards in their cubes too, which technically Husk Burster Swarm does all that too, but it doesn't just like straight up annihilate your opponent's like hand and as soon as it comes down. It's kind of just big dumb dude that you can cast really cheaply if you build around it.
Yeah, 2 things I do like about this. One, and this isn't a huge deal in our cube, but if you're playing cards like Soul Guide Lantern or Relic of Progenitus, which I know some people in the Peasant Cube space are doing, this card keeps all of its cost reduction even through exile. So you can, it's a way of putting those cards into your cube to attack graveyard strategies without completely gutting them because this 8-drop isn't going to be like an 8-drop, right? Mm-hmm. You'll actually still be able to cast it. And then 2, the menace on this, I think is pretty nice as a relevant upgrade to Writhing Necromass. Obviously, the extra point of stats is also pretty good, but I think the menace is really relevant here because what would happen a lot of times is you just chump block, and so now you're having to throw away, multiple pieces of cardboard, so your opponent's probably going to trade, opens them up to get Doombladed out of the game, that sort of thing. Yeah,
I do like the Crackle and Drake dynamic here where it counts your exile as well. It is nice to have counters to the counters, so to speak. So this, I don't think this card's going to blow anybody away, but it should be like a pretty imposing creature on board requires a double block, hits hard if it's not blocked, and should come down for a good 2 to 3 mana in the decks that people have built around it. So maybe a Golgari gold card, like a secret gold card there. Maybe if it's into like a Rakdos deck here and there, but we'll see. I think it's a clear step down from Hollow Marauder, but that's kind of the point for us. So archetypal test card is where we have this one, which brings us to the next one that I'd like you to talk about, because I think you're excited about this. It's the Otter again. He's back, but he's black this time.
Yeah, he's less cute this time, but, still a small furry animal. So Wix Patrol is 4 black for a 5/3 rat warlock. And when Wix Patrol enters, you mill 3 cards. When you do, target creature an opponent controls gets -X/-X until end of turn, where X is the greatest mana value of cards in your graveyard. So this is another one of those Skoa Peasant Brawler-y 6 mana kill a thing. It has some synergy with graveyard decks, so if you're playing it in that blue-black space, you get to mill for your Rise to the Tides, which if there's a Rise to the Tides sitting in your graveyard, it's almost always going to kill something. I think most of the time this is going to be like -3/-3 or -4/-4. Sometimes it'll be a little better, sometimes it'll be a little worse, but I would expect that to be the average use case of this card. I expect it to be okay. 5/3 I think is worse than a 4/4 because you can kill this with a deal 3, so that might be a notable downside. And then I think there's going to be some really awkward times that occasionally come up where you don't have, let's say your opponent has a 5/5 in play and you've got like 3 mana worth of cards in your graveyard, and you just have to like spin the wheel and hope that one of the top 3 cards is like something that lets you kill it, because you just have to do that. But that shouldn't come up too often, and I think oftentimes even then it'll be correct to just guarantee kill a smaller creature. Yeah, I think this card's fine. I'm not super excited about it. It feels like an archetypal test card. It might be too weak for us at this point. I could definitely see that. But Skoa and Peasant Brawler both played pretty well, so, I've been interested in these cards.
Yeah, I think I'm excited to try it out. I don't know that every single color needs like 6 mana kill a thing like at the top of its curve. It's kind of interesting that we're up to like 1 in each color at this point. Like maybe white doesn't have 1, maybe it doesn't, I'm just not thinking about it. But I guess the question is like what do you think is the deck that absolutely wants this? Probably Golgari, right? It's just a creature you can reanimate, it fills up the graveyard. You could probably play it in Dimir pretty well. Like, do you see a Rakdos deck playing this? Do you see an Orzhov deck playing this? Maybe Orzhov because it has like little recursion small ball and this is just the top end.
Yeah, I could see Orzhov because, if you're playing something like Blood for Bones in that deck, being able to buy this back and recast it and stuff's obviously pretty good. I think the Mardu space isn't super interested in this, though, and Rakdos almost certainly isn't. Rakdos is a deck that typically, the curve on those decks tend to be very, very tight.
Yeah, we'll see how this card does. I expect this to be like a really strong performer in the limited format, which is usually a good litmus test for, thinking it's going to be good in our cube. And it has like, I just like incidental mill on top of good creatures, so this should perform well. I'm just a little skeptical of like, do we need Skoa in every color? And if so, like, or if not, what colors need it more? So we'll see. We'll approach that down the line. But for now,
real quick, let's bring in Alabaster Host Intercessors.
There we go. We found the 6 drop.
Cycle.
We found them. Okay, that brings us to some spells, and honestly, like, I think we can blow through a lot of the black spells here because they're just like all the different kill spells in the set. But first off, we have Fell, which is the 1 in a black uncommon sorcery, destroy target creature. This is just efficiency, and it's a good role player, and I just like that it is a clean removal spell. Like, there's no rider on it. Sorcery, obviously, is like the downside when you compare it to something like Infernal Grasp, which has like a more obviously stated downside, but sorcery is a downside here, enough to the point where like I don't expect to see this in every single cube that's just jamming all the Doom Blades. But I think we'll try it out because we've tried to avoid like nothing but Doom Blades as black removal, and I think this has enough of a drawback to just play a clean, efficient, kill anything card.
Yeah, this feels like the kind of card that I like including cards that have meaningful play pattern differences. But it feels like the kind of card that Dunk's going to draft this cube and ask why this card's in instead of one of the 7 other Doom Blades we could be playing. But
the art is sweet, that's why.
Yeah, but this card forcing you to actually like pick your target before combat and not having quite the blow up potential. I actually think those sort of play pattern differences are upsides anyways. So
yeah,
not every card. I think Magic gets a lot more boring when you just pack like 8 instant speed kill anythings in your black section. I think like making a small adjustments like this to make your black drafters prioritize different cards differently is nice.
Yeah, I agree wholeheartedly there. I like when there's variation between, similar effects and similar slots rather than just like kind of Xerox and 3 or 4 Doom Blades and stuff like that. But that's just a personal taste. I could see how like people would argue that Fel is just worse than a lot of other options, and I get that.
Yeah. So then there's Feed the Cycle, which is 1 in a black for an instant, destroy target creature or planeswalker, and as an additional cost to cast the spell, you can either forage or pay black. And foraging, we sack a food or exile 3 cards from our graveyard. So I think a lot of times this is going to be close to like a Murderous Cut in terms of what it's doing. Mm-hmm. But I like that the floor is 3 mana instead of what Murderous Cut was 5.
Yeah, like the way to think about this is it's murder that can shave off a mana rather than like, oh, this is 2 mana removal that can, go up in price. I think it's, it's cost reduction on murder. So I guess it is just a strictly better murder in that sense, which is weird because like, why are there so many murders in this set? Like there's even another destroy target creature in black that we're just not even going to talk about for this episode, but like why are there like 4 or 5 murders in this set? But
yeah, we needed like a hunter just walking around. Yeah, get Garruk here or something, just hunting down animals. Like this could even be an archetypal card too. One thing you have mentioned here is the forage can enable you to trigger your roots, which is kind of cool for a deck that typically doesn't play that many interactive spells. Mm-hmm. So having one of your interactive spells, but doesn't play too many non-creature spells. And having one of those cards actually be able to trigger that sort of effect is pretty nice.
Yeah, it's got Bitter Triumph vibes, right? Where sometimes like discarding the card is going to be an upside for your deck, or like Bone Shards, where it's a less efficient removal spell than a normal Doomblade, but sometimes sacrificing the creature is an upside to your deck, and this has that for like graveyard-centric decks, especially the Insidious Roots deck. So I do like that it has some archetypal synergy on top of just being a fine little removal spell if, you just pay full price for it. Next one up, again, just removal alley here in black. We've got Consumed by Greed, 1 black for an uncommon instant. This has Gift a card, and it says target opponent sacrifices a creature with the greatest power among creatures they control. Notably power, not mana value there. If the gift was promised, you return a creature from your graveyard to your hand. So that's a nice little thing to tack on to this like soul shatter blot out type effect. We have noted that the opponent sacks highest power creature like effect or paradigm is worse in a Peasant Cube than it is in like a power max mainline cube like ours, because a lot of times the creature you need to kill is like a little utility dork like a Blood Artist or a Young Pyromancer and isn't always the highest power creature on board. So this is going to be good against like green decks where your opponent slams their 5/5 on turn 4 or 5 and like this just trades for it. But it's going to be a lot worse against those like kind of go wide utility creature decks that just flood the board with a bunch of little dudes.
Yeah, this card looks a lot less good when your opponent has, a Rosy Cotton or Emrakul's Messenger, maybe.
Yeah.
There's a lot of little engine-y cards that, especially in white, there are a good number of them. But just a lot of times, here in Peasant, Clarion Spirit's another one that, like, it oftentimes will not be the biggest card on the table, but you need to kill it. And so if you can't do that, you're going to be in some trouble.
Mm-hmm. And it doesn't say on the card, but I'm assuming if your opponent has multiple creatures that are like tied for highest power, they get to pick which one goes away. You don't get to pick. So it is nice to tack on like the Raised Dead. Like the Raised Dead's kind of cool, like to add on. But I think we actually passed on this, and I think the reason was that like our black section is just full of reanimation and Raised Deads right now. So like it didn't feel like we necessarily needed the upside to this effect on top of the effect already being worse in this environment. But I do think there's something here. Like maybe this is the type of card that if green just, is dominating, or like, God forbid you put Vine Mare in your cube and you just need outs to like these giant hexproof green creatures, like this could be the type of card you might consider.
Yeah, this is also the kind of card, you can put in your Vintage Cube. That way your Orcish Bowmasters will trigger when you gift a card, you pick up a creature, you kill their best creature, you ping their next creature. Obviously, Vintage Cube future staple here.
Yeah, and I don't want to discount too that like that's gift a card to get back a creature. Like that's a pretty, again, just like the Dewdrop thing, that's a pretty steep cost to give your opponent a card for you to also get a card. So
yeah, you really need to take a look at your opponent's deck and like think about, are your top decks better than theirs? Because if it's blue-black control deck, probably not. If it's green-black deck, probably not. if you're playing against red-white tokens, there's a good, or red-white aggro, good possibility that the best card in your graveyard is better than whatever they're going to pick up.
Yeah. One final black removal spell here to talk about. Easy one. This one's Savor for 1 in a black. It's an instant, and it says target creature gets -2/-2 until end of turn. Create a food token. Simple. I like it.
This one's horrific looking too. I've just now noticed the art is like it's like a snake, and it's like a snake eye, and he's looking at the squirrel he's about to munch on.
The flavor text says edibility is in the eye of the beholder.
Poor squirrel. So this card I think is really good. It's kind of hard to parse out exactly how much value I'm supposed to put on a food token because it's environmentally contextual. Like in the standard cube, I think this card's going to be a banger. Mm-hmm. In our Peasant Cube, I think it's going to be decent. I think one of the advantages a card like this has is, like we were mentioning a minute ago, a lot of times in Peasant, there's this weird thing where the most dangerous creatures are the tiny little utility creature on the opponent's side of the board, not the 3/3 or the 4/4 they have in play. And so this being able to snatch off a Rosy Cotton or a Young Pyromancer or something like that, these little creatures is pretty nice. And you come up a little bit on the exchange as well, which again, it's incremental value, but if you have any sort of way of taking advantage of the token, so for example, if you've got an Eviscerator's Insight in your deck, you can use that as the fuel for it so that you just get to turn it into a straight draw too.
Yeah, the trick with this card is using the food beyond just gaining life with it, which is something you can do if you really need the life, right? Because otherwise you could just play like, what's that Ixalan card, like Moment of Craven, 1 in a black, give something -2/-2, gain 2 life, and not have to worry about sacking the food. But, we've got bargain cards, we've got things that care about having artifacts on board.
Complete Huntmaster, that sort of thing.
Yeah, there's enough ways to use food beyond just sacrificing food for life, which is what you don't want to use food for if you can avoid it, that we think this is enough. Pick off a creature, get a rectangle that you can use towards something else, and that's probably enough to make this card good, even if it's like, going to wind up poorly against your opponent's like 2-mana 2/3 or 3-mana 3/3 some amount of the time. 2 more cards here. Why don't you take the next one? Because it's a very interesting card that we've chatted about a little. I'll take the last one, and then we'll move into red.
Sure. I'm actually going to talk about 2 cards at the same time because it occurs to me we didn't put the other one on this list, despite the fact that we're going to try it. So the first one is Stargaze, and this is the one that we're not playing, which is a shame because I think this is my single favorite art in the entire set. But Stargaze is black X for a sorcery. Look at twice X cards from the top of your library, put X cards from among them into your hand, the rest into your graveyard, and then you lose X life. So this is a really inefficient card that has some really cool scaling. If you can get this to 4, for example, it's a draw 4 that also puts 4 cards in your graveyard for all of your graveyard synergies at a hefty cost of life in your whole turn. Problem with this card, I think, is that the low values are really, really inefficient. And as you start getting into those higher values, you're taking a pretty big life hit on top of taking a turn off to be able to pick up the cards. And in addition to all of that, you start running the risk of actually decking yourself because, if you put 4 or 5 mana into this, you're basically milling a quarter of your deck if you think about the cards you're drawing and putting into the graveyard. The other card is Dire Sight, which is going to be an efficient draw spell. So Dire Sight is 2 in a black for a sorcery, and you surveil 2 and then draw 2 cards, lose 2 life. So this is a strict upgrade over a card we didn't have on the client, an old card called Read the Bones, which was scry 2, draw 2, lose 2 life at sorcery speed. This is just a strict upgrade. We decided we were going to go ahead and try Dire Sight because while Stargaze has this great art, but also a dream, like Stargaze, for 4 or 5 sounds like something really cool to do. Dire Sight's just a much more reliable card. It's much more efficient and probably fits inside our environment better if one of these cards is going to actually work.
Yeah, Stargaze has the higher ceiling by a lot, like a much higher ceiling, but I think when it comes to comparing cards, I'm usually in favor of the more consistent lower floor over the inconsistent higher ceiling. And that means I'm just going to, lean towards Dire Sight in this comparison, especially because, Stargaze for X equals 1 is first off harder to cast than Dire Sight, but is also just, a weaker effect of the same exact card. So you do have to go X is 2 or higher on Stargaze before it's better than Dire Sight's, average, baseline case. And then you're talking about, 4+ mana sorcery draw spell, which is just a really hard thing to justify, especially when it loses you life on top of things. So
I think they could have tuned like one more knob on Star Days and it would have been really good. So
just
if
a blanket 2 life or something, maybe.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, if it was less life, or if it was an instant, or any other number of things, I think this card would have been really cool and we'd be talking about it. But yeah, Dire Sight I think is just going to be a solid little role player. Probably not a card that'll be around for more than a set or two when we get something that's inevitably better, but decent little effect.
Yeah, perfectly fine. And I have seen cubes out there that still run Read the Bones, so like you just got an upgrade to Read the Bones, which is sad because Read the Bones has always been a sweet card. But I actually said I was going to take it. Why don't you go ahead and talk about the last black card here, because this was a hashtag not for us card that I believe you added to this list.
Yeah, so the last card is Bandit's Talent. So it's 1 in a black for a class enchantment. Classes are brought back from AFR. I'm sure we'll have talked about this in the main cube episode, but when Bandit's Talent enters, each opponent discards 2 cards unless they discard a non-land card. So most of the time, this is going to be they just discard a spell. And then for 1 black, you get at the beginning of each opponent's upkeep, that player has 1 or fewer cards in hand. They lose 2 life. And then for 3 in a black, you can go to level 3. And at the beginning of your draw step, you draw an additional card for each opponent who has 1 or fewer cards in hand. So this card, I think, is an interesting card for a format like Historic Artisan or a cube that somehow supports 8-rack type effects. Mm-hmm. If you're able to do that, then I think this card's pretty good because it's both an enabler and a payoff for what it's doing. The problem with these sort of discard payoffs is, one, they're really, really soft to all of the card advantage that comes stapled to creatures and the blue card draw spells and that sort of thing. There's a lot of ways to fight back against it in Modern Magic. And then 2 is that you really need a density of both enablers, so the discard spells, and payoffs. And typically, outside of this card, the payoffs were just generically really, really bad cards that only worked if they all kind of came together. So I think the problem with Bandit's Talent, I think, is it's kind of going to be sitting alone in the cube space of cards that are good in this sort of theoretical strategy, while also that are like doing the thing and enabling the thing, which, as we've seen repeatedly, is pretty important for a lot of these kind of cards, right?
Yeah, I think this is the perfect example of a hashtag not for us card, right? Because I'm sure you can construct cubes that have a discard theme or take advantage of that to some extent, but like, I have a hard time imagining we would ever land on a cut to even try this card out in our cube, and then it just feels like this one-off that's not really doing anything particular. It reminds me a lot of Davriel, the War of the Spark Davriel, that has that same static ability. If your opponent has like 1 or less card in hand, they lose 2 life on your upkeep or their upkeep or whatever. And I like this a little bit better than that, because you can't just attack it down. Davriel's a Planeswalker, so like this is probably sticking on board, but like, I don't know. Like, it's not doing anything thematic for us. I don't really see cubes with discard themes in them because it's just not a particularly fun theme in the first place. Not to mention it can like actually backfire against certain types of graveyard based decks and stuff like that. So I think this is a really cool card. I think
the not fun thing is probably the biggest thing here too, right? Is like you just don't want to put this kind of deck in your cube.
It's kind of, this is how a lot of the classes in this set are, and maybe I'm like rose colored, glasses for classes. That was hard to say, because the ones that are really good are like some of my favorite cards, like Warlock class, Ranger class, and stuff like that. I think it's just a really cool card type. But the classes in this set almost unanimously across the board like have a 3rd level that just does not matter, and is super expensive to get to, but don't quite get there on the first level or 2. I mean, we're going to talk later about the green one, which is the best class in the set by far. But even at the mainline cube, like we probably talked about 1 class, and the rest are like, yeah, this just doesn't feel like it's. They're doing very specific things for very specific archetypes. Like there's an equipment one, there's a spell matters one, there's stuff like that, and they just don't get there generically enough unless you're playing into those themes.
Yeah, they feel like they're just not quite pushed, whereas I felt like all of the AFR classes were pushed a little too much. Like we don't run Warlock class for a reason, for example.
Yes, Warlock Peasant class is busted.
And and even in the main cube, like Ranger's class is still really, really good. Mm-hmm. And so I think there is a bit of rose-tinted glasses there, where in particular those 2 classes, but there was also, I'm thinking from AMR, Paladin class is the name of the one. They like pumps your board and like makes your opponent's cards more expensive. Even those are pretty good.
Yeah.
And then there was a number of other ones that had situational roleplay value, but these really felt like they were asking something very specific that wasn't in any other way supported in the set, which is a weird place to be for uncommons. Like if they were when it was just the rare ones doing that, that's one thing. But like, what am I doing in the format with this?
Because you've got this like discard one, which isn't like a theme in the set. You've got a red one that like pays you off for equipment, which isn't really like a huge theme in the set. It kind of works with the mice cards and the Valiant cards. And then you've got like a white one that cares about like non-creature permanents entering the battlefield, which is like, these are all like probably fine cards and cool for certain kinds of builds that support them, but they're not supported in the set they're in, and they're certainly like not going to make our cube. So it's a little sad. We'll talk about the green one later, which is excellent, but this is I like this as a call out to at least talk about the classes and how they just didn't really hit the mark for the context of the set that they're in this time.
Yeah, which is a shame. I really like classes as a mechanic. So
yeah, so that's going to do it for black. And with that, we are going to move into red. Our first red card here is going to be a little raccoon guy. It's called Brazen Collector. It's 1 in a red for a 2/1 uncommon raccoon rogue. It has first strike, and it says whenever a Brazen Collector attacks, add red mana. You don't lose that mana as phases and steps end this turn. I'm going to need your help on this one a little bit, because first off, we've classified it as a test card. It looks like a slam dunk card, not quite a forever card, but just like a rock solid 2-drop. But it doesn't have any archetypal synergies, so I have a hard time imagining like we won't cut this for something down the line. But what I need your help with is helping me figure out why I don't like this card, because we've recognized Magda, Magda Brazen Outlaw is a very good card. That's the 2-mana 2/1 dwarf that makes a treasure when it becomes tapped. And we've even talked about that as an example of polarity in the mainline cube. We've cut it for those reasons from the mainline cube, because it's very brutal early on in the game. And this is obviously like very similar to Magda as far as, 2-mana 2/1 that makes some mana each subsequent turn, and it even has first strike, so it's not like completely dead later in the game. Why is it there's some cognitive dissonance here? Can you explain to me why I understand Magda is a great card and why I don't like this card? Like, I can't quite figure it out myself.
Well, see, I am of the opinion that neither of those cards are particularly amazing. Like, I was one of the people that was talking about how I thought Magda was not a very good card, like early, I feel like. And I'm hesitant on this one. I think it will play fine, but I don't know. There's something, I guess, like if you're trying to compare it directly to Magda, the downside, of course, it doesn't color fix, it doesn't make a game object, and it doesn't let you sandbag the mana. Although those things rarely come up with Magda, I'm uncertain how this is going to play. And I think you've made a note here that I really agree with, which is in particular the Peasant Cube, where you're not just slamming a really, really powerful 4-drop in a lot of cases. How good is this card going to be when you have to start making cuts in your very synergistic Peasant deck? Because your Peasant decks tend to be, well, they'll play generically good cards in them. They do tend to like it when those generically good cards have some sort of application to their overall game plan. And I'm not 100% certain where this is really going to fit in. Maybe Gruul, but Gruul is a big fan of its cards being big and able to rumble, right? So I don't know if I can help you with the why you don't like this card, because I think this is almost strictly better than Magda in 80% of cases. With that, I can't really help you, but I'm not 100% sold on this card. Like, I'm not sure how good it's going to be. And then the one toughness is a little questionable, even with first strike. There are a lot of things that this still can't really attack into without using that mana on a burn spell.
Yeah, I don't know. It's interesting because, like, I'm sure if you put this card in your deck, it's fine, but it is. Like, I'm not on board with saying a 2-mana 2/1 first strike is a good draw later in the game. Like, first strike is not leading me to believe, like, oh, I'm okay drawing this later. So, like, you have to play this on turn 2, or else, like, it's not even good on turn 3. This is not a good 3-draw play. It has to be turn 2. So, like, I'm seeing it just way too much narrow utility.
Yeah.
It'll be interesting because, like, we're recording this now, but by the time, like the listener will have already heard it, but we will be talking about this card for the mainline cube as well, and I know Chris likes it quite a bit, so we'll have to like retroactively kind of see what he's thinking for the mainline cube. And of course, like, ramp is just better in the mainline cube than it is in Peasant Cube. So yeah, I ended up not liking the card. I think one thing that also bothers me is that Magda Brazen Outlaw is not an outlaw, but this card that is like very clearly designed after Magda Brazen Outlaw is an outlaw. It's just like this raccoon. But yeah, not too much else to say about this one other than, like, this is a fine aggro card and maybe a good rule card, but I don't actually really like it that much. I added it here because it feels like I'm expected to talk about this card, but I'm not actually sold on it.
Yeah, I think the first strike is going to make it a little more relevant later into the game, but I don't think, even in the main cube, I question whether that's going to be enough to justify it. Maybe it will because of the explosiveness of it, but you're right. In the main cube, if you draw or in the Peasant Cube, if you draw this on turn 3, turn 4, it's just such a bad investment of mana, and you're really just not going to get a lot out of it. So I could see this card being a card that reads really well and then plays quite poorly.
Yeah, we'll have to try it out. You mentioned the art is weird. I have to zoom in on this.
So what is going on with his feet? Because I can't really tell.
I'm trying to zoom in. Maybe he has no feet.
Like, he's holding the rope with his feet, but it doesn't make any sense.
I will have to ask Aldo Dominguez because I don't quite understand what's going on here. But talk to me about these otters. We've got a batch of red otters coming up here.
Yeah, so the first one is Coruscation Mage, which is 1 in a red for a 2/2 Otter Wizard with Offspring for 2. And whenever you cast a non-creature spell, this creature deals 1 damage to each opponent. So this is just another variant of the Kessig Breather Firebrand Archer type of card. I do think this card is a good bit better. Those cards are fine in lower rarity environments. They aren't quite good enough, or maybe they're a little too narrow would be a better way of putting it for this cube. But this card in particular, the Offspring, again, just plays such a flexible role, and it's possible it's too expensive. I will throw that out there, that maybe it ends up being that 4 mana for 3/3 with the stats across 2 bodies is not worth it. But if you pay that 4 mana, you've essentially gotten 3/3 worth of stats across 2 bodies, so a single removal spell doesn't clean it up. And you get a Gutter Snipe a Gutter Snipe trigger for 2 damage every time you cast a spell. Specifically, it's 2 1 damage triggers, so there could be situations where that's even better or a little worse. But in any case, you're dealing 2 damage every time you cast a spell. You're making 2 bodies for your like Rakdos Sack deck, for example, or your Boros Tokens deck. And in those Rakdos decks specifically, a lot of times the deck wins through non-combat damage, and they cast a reasonable number of non-creature spells. So I actually could see this card being the kind of card that looks like an Izzet card, but actually plays well, or perhaps even optimally, in a different deck.
Yeah, maybe we label it as an archetypal card because it screams like blue-red, spells. But maybe bridge card is like the actual correct place to put it because, like you said, like Offspring just makes any card that's like kind of designed for a specific archetype suddenly work with a bunch of other archetypes like Sacrifice and token, like Naya tokens and stuff like that. Not that like Coruscation Mage is ideal for Naya tokens, but it is like another home that the card could have in unexpected ways. And I think, this also just gets kind of like the strict upgrade tag as well, because there are cubes out there I still see that play Firebrand Archer, and correct me if I'm wrong, I think this is actually just a strictly better Firebrand Archer. It's not strictly better than Kessig Fire Breather, but I think you'd rather have, I guess it depends on the deck, but I think most of the time you'd rather have a 2/2 with this effect than a 1/3 with this effect. But
yeah, I think the biggest upside here is the Offspring being able to spend your mana later into the game.
Yeah, it's just it's a good example of a baseline fine card that probably doesn't get there on its own, but is definitely worth a consideration now that you've tacked on Offspring, which is how a couple of designs in this set work. We already talked about the 3 mana rabbit in white that's like just kind of a bad card on its own, but tack on Offspring and suddenly it's a good card that's worth talking about. I think that's what's going on here as well.
Yep. And so our other otter is Harnesser of Storms, which is a 3 mana 1/4, and whenever you cast a non-creature spell or an otter spell, you may exile the top card of your library. Until the end of turn, you may play that card. It triggers once each turn. So this one is, I think, a little bit worse, but it's pretty interesting as a value engine, which is something that I'm always interested in when we see them at Peasant. A couple of things that, I guess, not red flags for like concerns for power level, but more like just things that may make this card not work so well. A 3-mana 1/4 is a really awkward stat line in red because almost all of our red archetypes are aggressive unless you're kind of splashing red. They tend towards the aggressive side because that's just what red does at the peasant level. It's not really possible to do the grindy red thing as well in most sets. And you can kind of make it work in like red-black in our cube. There's, I think, a hidden red-black rock deck that's fine. But this card has it has an awkward stat line. It's not aggressively statted. It's very, very anemic. You're blocking with this card. But you also kind of don't want to block with it because it's your value engine. And if your opponent has any removal or way to finish it off or anything like that, you're putting it at risk. And then the other thing is that unlike a lot of the more recent versions of this effect, this is the experimental synthesizer text of it only works until the end of turn. So we play this on 3, we go to 4, assume we have 4 mana. If we spend more than 1 or 2 mana on our non-creature spell, we probably are not going to be able to cast the cards we hit off this unless it's a land. So I think this is a very potent card, but it's awkwardly in the space of wanting to be in a grindy deck with a very, very low mana curve and lots of non-creature spells, and I'm not 100% certain that deck actually exists in our cube.
Yeah, unlike the Coruscation Mage, this is just like straight up locked to an archetypal card like a spells-based deck. And I think you actually have to be, despite this being a 1/4 like you mentioned, it's really only at its best in a proactive Izzet deck, because if you're playing a defensive Izzet deck with a bunch of counter spells, like you're probably not getting good value off of this. Like I don't know how you're holding up a counter spell and frequently, you know, like getting value off of the card you're flipping on the opponent's turn, because it doesn't last until the end of your next turn, right? So if you trigger it on an opponent's turn, you have until the end of their turn to cast the card that you flip, and you miss out on lands. So there's again a little bit of dissonance in, you know, what kind of decks want this. But you know, the upside of like, oh, this is a 3-mana creature that could potentially draw you 3, 4, 5 cards. You know, that's the upper echelon of what this card can do. That's not going to do it every single time, but I'm not going to ignore a card that could do that as well. I don't think we're actually making room for it.
I was going to say, the spoiler alert for this card is I don't think we're actually...
Yeah, but I could see, like, if you're just looking for, like, a value engine of some sort for your Izzet decks, I could see this being, you know, a payoff. Like, it does have very high upside, despite the floor being pretty weak.
I actually think that the shell it's going to fit in is if you support some sort of red-black deck that's playing, that just wants to play a bunch of removal and value cards. I think this fits into that sort of quote-unquote Jund space, right? Where you're just playing relatively cheap, efficient spells, you're going to generate incremental advantage, and this is just another piece of that puzzle.
It does work nicely with plot cards, like a Highway Robbery, you know, because like the turn you cast that, you probably have all your mana open. So that's a nice little space for it. But I think we're on like maybe 1 or 2 plot cards ourselves, so that's not really swaying it that much.
Yeah, I mean, also most of the best plot cards at Common Uncommon were creatures anyways. Yeah.
This next one is one of the 2, like, look what they did to our boy cards. So Quake Tusk Boar, there's actually a handful of cards, 4 or 5 in the set, that are just like French vanilla creatures with a bunch of different keywords on them, and Quake Tusk Boar is one of them. It's 3 red for a 5/5 uncommon elemental boar with reach, trample, and haste. So I did call this a strict upgrade. You pointed out it's not actually like a complete strict upgrade over Charge and Monster Sword, because it is double red, Monster Sword single red, so strict upgrade doesn't quite work, but for our purposes, like, we will treat it as such. And I mean, Charge and Monster Sword, like, I don't know how many people have that card in their, like, you know, Eternal Peasant Cubes, but man, it holds up for us. That's the you know, Ixalan 5-mana 5/5 trample haste, like Reality Smasher at uncommon, and here we are with an upgraded version that also has reach. And you asked me, like, is reach enough of an upside that we should play this over the slightly more splashable card that's like a little more iconic? And I do think reach is like a pretty meaningful upgrade on a creature like this, because even though Monster Sword only goes in, you know, beat down decks, it's your curve topper to try and kill your opponent. Sometimes you are behind and you top deck the Monster Sword and you're like, well, shoot, I'm still dead to my opponent's flyers. And like, this could be the difference in you winning the game like that. Like, yeah, you want to smash with this card. Like, reach and haste is such a weird combination on a card, but I do think this is a meaningful upgrade to a card that's pretty much stood the test of time since we've had it.
Yeah, I could not be more sad for this. I really wish if you're going to power creep Monster Sword, could we not have done it in something that would have made me question whether we should even include it off power level. Like, could we not have given it a keyword that would have just made it even more scary, or given an activated ability or something?
Menace would have been nice.
Yeah. I don't think reach is super relevant most of the time. I think it's a really awkward thing to add to this card. I don't like the art very much. It kind of is, actually looking at it, a little reminiscent of Monstrosaur, but just kind of worse art, which is actually a rare miss for this set, because I think generally the art for this set was fantastic. And I'm not trying to poo-poo on it. I just am mostly salty because the Charging Monstrosaur art is really, really great. It's kind of like a nod to Jurassic Park, and just really, it's just such a, like you said, it really held up for so long, and it just kind of got replaced by a card that has a, like you said, meaningful but not exciting difference.
I think reach is meaningful. It sounds like you're a little less on board with that, but like I do think this is an upgrade, and like you don't really splash Monstrosaur that often, so the red doesn't hurt it too much. But yeah, pour one out for the boy. We've got an upgrade here, and we are going to play it. That does bring us to, I think this is a very interesting card to talk about. Heartfire Hero is a red mana for a 1/1 uncommon mouse soldier with Valiant. I think this is the first Valiant card we're talking about. So it says, whenever this creature becomes the target of a spell or ability you control for the first time each turn, do blank. In this case, put a +1/+1 counter on it. And then it also has the text, whenever Heartfire Hero dies, it deals damage equal to its power to each opponent. So Valiant is basically like heroic for spells and abilities, but you only get the trigger once per turn.
Man, this card's scary.
This is, I had this as like a test card originally, like in my mind, but you marked it down as efficient role player, and I think that's right. Like, we're not recreating our cube to make Valiant work, but when we did a pass through, it looks like there's like so many, the fact that it works with abilities as well, which includes equipment, things like Bone Splitter and Rabbit Battery and Barb Batterfist, like there's so many things that actually just trigger Valiant that you should be able to get a counter on this, like at least the first counter, and that's not even counting spells like Monstrous Rage and actual combat tricks, but like if you can trigger this regularly once per turn, it gets way out of hand fast, and the death trigger's like kind of good. So I think we agreed, you need to get one Valiant trigger before this card is like the best one drop we have. And then from there it just gets better.
Yeah, exactly. If you get one trigger on this, it's competing with the best red one drops. I mean, just in general. And if you get a second trigger, it's just way better. So yeah, the first trigger, it's going to be a 2/2. It will die to deal at least 2 damage, but keep in mind, a lot of the ways that you will get this targeted by Valiant are going to be something that puts a +1 counter on it. There are quite a number of those kind of cards floating around in the cube, and if you do that, it's going to be even bigger. If you play a Barb Batterfist on it, you do have to, I guess with Barb Batterfist specifically, you do have to have...
yeah, it works the way you want it to, because you put the equip trigger on the stack, then you get the counter, and then the equip happens, so like it works profitably.
Yeah, so it's a 3/1 at that point. If you Bone Splitter it, it's a 4/2.
I mean, no Valiant trigger yet. You attack this into whatever, a 3/3. They block, you Monstrous Rage. It becomes a 5/3. Trades off with your opponent's 3/3, tramples for 2 damage, and then it has the death trigger that deals 5 to your opponent. Like, that is literally just this card plus Monstrous Rage with no... And maybe that's like, Monstrous Rage is an excellent card, but... like, the death trigger can just kill people sometimes. Like, that's a pretty scary death trigger on a card that scales its own power.
Yeah, it's fairly easy, I think, to accidentally get a counter on this. It plays incredibly well with equipment. The Boros decks that we run already want cards like Bone Splitter. This card's really good, I think. I think you want to make sure when you put this in your deck, sometimes it might require you to put something like a Rabbit Battery in your deck that you maybe otherwise would have liked to have passed on. Mm-hmm. But I think once you have met that, I think we're looking at a pretty powerful card. There's also there's some fairly cute ways to do this. I mean, and this won't come up often, but you could trigger this with stuff like On-Cop Crasher, right? Making your creature unable to block. I'm sure there's others, if I looked through the cube, that could do things like that.
Things you normally don't target your own creatures with, but you totally can, yeah.
Yeah. So, yeah, I mean, I think this card is very, very good, and I am hesitant to say it's a forever card, but I feel like we are moving in a direction in Magic where we are going to see more cards that work with this, like map tokens, rather than less.
Oh yeah.
And so I expect this card to just get better over time. So I'm really close to putting this as a forever card. I just want to play with it first before I would make it. It's the kind of card that I don't feel like I can just like, unlike the other 3 cards that I said I think are forever cards, I don't think I can safely say this is a forever card just looking at it, but I'm right there that to the point of almost like, I almost want to say this could be a red flag card. Like this card could be ridiculous.
It could be. I want it to be a forever card. Let's put it that way. So like, especially because it gets stupid, stinky Embereth Veteran out of our cube. You know, like we're finally free of like bad Savannah Lions, but.
Yeah, I think the thing with this card is balancing between like figuring out whether it's going to be more often at the floor or more often at the ceiling. And if it's more often at its floor, if it's just a 1/1 for 1 that dies for a damage, like that's not good.
No.
But once you trigger it one time, as long as you trigger it one time, it's really good.
Yeah, I have high hopes for it. I hope it pans out, and I would be very excited if a year from now we're still playing this card and it's like gotten even better. Unless it is like somehow oppressive, which hopefully not, but like maybe.
Also, Rosie Cotton makes this into a 3/3.
I
wasn't supposed to say that.
Yep, he has a note here that says don't mention Rosie Cotton, and there we are. Let's go through the red removal corner here, kind of like we did with black, except the red removal spells I think are all a little more interesting to talk about. The first one, something that I believe we will talk about, have already talked about on the mainline cube, just because I think it's an interesting design to think about, not because it's an excellent card. This is a Blooming Blast, 1 in a red for an uncommon instant. It has Gift a Treasure, and it deals 2 damage to target creature. If you promise the gift, it deals 3 damage to that creature's controller as well. I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think like we all landed on not really liking this card because 2 damage is best early in the game when given your opponent a treasure is at its worst for you. Mm-hmm. And 2 damage, like when given a treasure is more of an acceptable thing to do, you're probably at a point in the game where 2 damage isn't as good. So like, yeah, you get to like bolt your opponent for free sometimes, but you just can't do it early, which means you're not getting full value off of this card often enough.
Sure. Yeah, this card would have been amazing if it was the damage on it was flipped, right? If it was a deal 3 that dealt 2 when you gifted a treasure, I think it would play much better, and I would be way more interested in it.
What do you think if this was a gift a fish, you know, instead of gift a treasure? Is that still too bad?
Probably. I mean, it's definitely not as bad for you, but
yeah, gift a treasure. This is the only card that uses gift a treasure too, so it's kind of interesting that they balance this in a way that like kind of makes sense, because 2 mana deal like shock a creature, deal 3 to the opponent, I think is a pretty good card. So I think they recognize that.
I think it would have been really funny to have this gift of food.
I was thinking that too, but I was like, that doesn't make any sense. But I get it. So yeah, this one's a pass. Like we rate it. It doesn't even really deserve the rating because like none of us are that interested in playing it. Rabid Gnaw is the next one. Gnaw. It's 1 in a red for an uncommon instant. Target creature you control gets +1/+0 until end of turn. Then it deals damage equal to its power to target creature you don't control. So red getting in on the pushed Rabid Bite effects now. Obviously a little tongue-in-cheek with the Rabid Gnaw name. I don't like. I have this as a role player because it's just a removal spell. It's maybe more of an archetypal card because you have to be in a creature-based deck for this to really be something you want over a different removal spell. I do not think this is like some must-play excellent card. I don't know that it's better than like a typical Lightning Strike. Certainly not better than like Scorch and Shot type cards or Torch the Witness, things like that. But what I liked about this is it's a different take on red removal for your creature-based deck, such that if you're drafting and you're like the Gruul deck, you might be able to wheel this. You know, like there's a little bit of a problem sometimes where you're like a red creature deck and you want a couple pieces of removal, but all the red spells decks at the table are just like, I will snatch every single removal spell I can get that's in red, every shock, every lightning strike, so on and so forth. And like those decks shouldn't care about Rabid Gnaw. So you might be able to get it like really late, and maybe that's not enough to like play it over, I think, a more efficient burn spell, but I did think it was enough to like point it out. This is also a pretty good card when it does kill a creature, you know, connect. Mm-hmm. You connect in combat, you maybe get a prowess trigger or something. Like there's enough here, I think, that it's worth playing if you want a red removal spell that's specialized for a creature-based deck. But I don't necessarily think like it's 1-for-1 better than your typical burn spells.
Yeah, I think this is a card that'll probably not make it very long because I suspect the general consensus will just be that this card is bad. And I also think there's a bit of an issue with a card that's pretty explicitly going to end up being a Gruul card, given that Gruul just gets, or that green gets a bunch of fight spells anyways. So I can see this card not panning out, but I do agree with the sentiment that it's nice to have something that like the red-black grindy or blue-red spells decks or whatever are just going to poach, and that your more creature-based red deck can utilize.
Yeah, it reminds me a little of that Ikoria card, Blitz of the Thunder Raptor, which was like a red damage spell that scaled with the number of instants and sorceries in your graveyard. And it's like, if you want, well, that's even a worse example because like that's just is it gold card, and is already the color that gets to use all the lightning strikes, whereas this is like a Gruul gold card. So basically just like a specialized slot for a removal spell for a specific deck. Probably not enough to like actually play something like this, but I did want to mention it.
Also, weirdest art in the set. Do we agree on that?
It's a little on the nose, as it were, on the tooth, perhaps. Name and art combined is a little bit like, yeah, I see what you're doing there. Like, I get it. Talk to me about the last red removal spell, because this is one you brought up that I think I'm on board with.
Dang. I just came up with the, I'm not enameled with this card, like, that's,
yeah. Well, you could have just said it.
That'll get removed in post.
Yeah.
So, Playful Shove is the next card. It's 1 in a red for a sorcery, and it deals 1 damage to any target, and then you draw a card. So I think this is an efficient role-player-y type card. Removal spells that draw a card are pretty good. There's a lot of X1s in the cube. We've mentioned, the Pyromancers, the Blood Artist, Rosy Cotton, the blue 2-drops, that sort of thing. There's enough cards that get 2-for-1 by this card that I actually think this card could end up being quite good. It's a cheap way to enable Prowess or Spectacle type effects for any of the decks that care. I don't think your Gruul deck is really going to be interested in this, but I think this is like a pretty good Izzet/Rakdos card.
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty straightforward. There's not too much to say. I'm willing to bet this kills like 40% of the creatures in our cube or something like that, straight up. Like, there's so many X1s, and I kind of like that sometimes your opponent plays like Erase the Alarms or something along those lines, like puts 2 X1s on board, and it feels bad to just like use a full removal spell on one of them, but at the very least this like is a 2-for-1 that will let you trade half and half for what your opponent's done. I also like its inclusion in this set as a way to like pick off an Offspring token without feeling really bad about it. There's actually not a lot of X1 hate in this set, if you noticed or didn't notice, but this seems fine. Like, this seems perfectly fine. It's not going to be Red's best removal spell, but it should be a nice little role player. And if you are looking for, X1 hate, explicit X1 hate, but you don't necessarily want to bring in a bunch of like infests and pyroclasm, this might be the type of card that could interest you.
Yep, and that takes care of red for us.
Yes, which pushes us into green, which is a really large section here. So we'll hit it with a brisk pace, starting off with Busy Bodyguard. This is 1 in a green for a 2/1 uncommon Squirrel Warrior with Offspring 2. When it enters, you may forage. If you do, put 2+1/+1 counters on it. So that's the whole text there. But to break down what that means is, first off, you can play this as a 2-mana 2/1 that if you sack a food or exile 3 cards from your graveyard, you get to make it a 4/3, and that's okay. If you get to do that, a 2-mana 4/3 is pretty good, though you obviously can't do that until later in the game. If you Offspring it, each creature, this one plus the Offspring, gets the option to do that. So if you happen to have like 2 foods or 6 cards in your graveyard or some combination, the maximum effect you get here is 4 mana for 7 power and 6 toughness across 2 bodies, which is excellent even if you still only get to do that later in the game. What I really like here is that this just is a bridge card for a lot of different decks. It can work in tokens. It can work in like Golgari graveyard decks. It can even be like a Gruul beatdown card. Selesnya tokens is a place I could see playing this. I don't know, like, a lot of times I think you're going to see this in your opening hand and you're going to run it out as Goblin Piker and it's going to be like, oh, this card's not that good. It's got the Rictus Robber vibes, right? Where it's like, there's a dream, but the dream isn't going to come up every single time, so maybe it's not as good as it looks. But yeah, I'm excited about the kind of like cross compatibility of this card in different archetypes. I think you sounded like you were a little bit lower on it than me, though.
Yeah, I'm a little skeptical that we're going to be able to make this work. But I also think that the dream or the ceiling on this card is high enough that we should try to make it work and see, we should put it in, see how it plays out. I like a few things about it. Like you said, it cross sections a number of different decks, and it also plays, like you noted here, it plays really well with Peregrine Took, which I think is a pretty good card in green. And so I think like if you're playing this in the tokens deck, you'll probably be able to get food. If you're playing this in the roots deck, I will say one of the way the roots deck loses is that you run them down early. And while Goblin Piker is not something that we're super interested in, Goblin Piker, that then if you draw it after you've set up a little bit, can trigger your roots and come down as like a 4/3 or even a 7/6 worth of stats, is something that I think is a high enough ceiling that we should be trying it out.
Yeah, and I did want to mention, just to clarify on the Peregrine Took point, that like Peregrine Took says whenever you make a token, you make an additional food on top of the token. So the Offspring token will come into play alongside a food token, even if you didn't have any already. And then you can consume that token for one of the ETBs here to get your extra 2 counters. So Peregrine Took is just proven to be a very good card, regardless of synergy. So
yeah, turn three, Peregrine Took into turn 4. This though is a pretty solid synergy.
Yeah, and like maybe if you have what is it called, Stitcher Supplier, like Stitcher Supplier into Bushy Bodyguard and just get a 4/3 on turn 2, like maybe that's not even Magical Christmas Land, because a 2-mana 4/3 doesn't just like win the game. But I do like this card. I think it's pretty cool, and we'll see how often it gets to do the thing. Clifftop Lookout, 2 and a green for a 1/2 uncommon Frog Scout with reach. When it enters, reveal cards from the top of your library until you reveal a land. Put it on the battlefield tapped and the rest on the bottom. I put the strictly better tag on this, though. Yes, I know it's not actually definitionally strictly better than Elvish Rejuvenator, but I do see people play Elvish Rejuvenator in Peasant Cubes. That's the 3-mana 1/1 that like gets a land from your top 5. It's a little bit different, but Clifftop Lookout can never miss, assuming you have lands in your deck. It just keeps digging until you hit a land. It's a 1/2 instead of a 1/1, and reach is like not the most impressive thing on a 1/2, but it does hold off this kills Lingering Souls, right? Like, who's going to win in a battle, Lingering Souls or Clifftop Lookout? It's going to be the Lookout. So
of course, and until you pump one of them, and then
yeah. Look, come on, man. Like, let me have my frog. This is a fine little 3-drop. This is not the type of card that I'm like, oh, we have to put this in. It does read like the type of card that people freak out about. Like, people just love the 3-mana, like, District Guide type cards, Borderland guys. I think it's just okay. Like, a 3-mana 1/2 reach is an upgrade over a vanilla 1/1, but it's still not an excellent card. So, I like it. I don't think it slots into RQ, but it did seem like the type of card we should mention, because it's just got all of the right knobs pushed for a random peasant level card.
This feels like the regular Muldriftery type cards that are in every set that are increasingly good, but also we don't really aim to just fill our cube full of those. And this isn't really doing any specific synergies. It kind of has like some synergies with blink effects, I guess. This is what I would consider a strictly better card, because I think when we talk about strictly better, we've mentioned this before, that the bar is kind of like, I can't see a reason I would ever put the card that is strictly worse than this into my cube, even if there are like edge cases that you would.
It's like hashtag strictly better for us is probably the way to put it, because like the second you say strictly better and it's like there's a 1% chance this other thing happens, like you'll get somebody who comes out of the woodworks like, well, strictly better actually means this, and this. So it's like, I'm always very intentional about when I use that language, because people just think they're super smart when it comes to that. And I'm like, yes, I know, I get it. I was being like pedantic when I use the actual term strictly better, but
oh yeah, it's like, well, did you know that if you're playing Elf Tribal, that Elvish Rejuvenator triggers your tribal? It's like, yeah,
which is not even like, okay, anyway, don't even get me started on strictly better conversation. But the interesting thing, like you were saying, like this card is fine. If we put it in our cube, it would see play. The thing is, like, we already have things like Land of War Visionary. We have Eldrazi Repurposer from the last set. Like, you could fill a green section with 6 cards that do this, but we've already got good ones, and this doesn't feel like it's meaningfully better than those other ones. So it's a pass, but it's a good card.
After we started talking about it, it was really hard to think of a situation where, like, we're cutting Jewel Thief this time around, And I think I would run Jewel Thief, Llanowar Visionary, or Eldrazi Repurposer. I would want all three of those cards in my cube before I considered this card, unless I had I'm trying to think of like a very specific reason, but maybe Blink. But it's just such a low stat line by comparison. Those other cards are bridge cards because your green mid-range decks will put them in their deck and play them.
Yeah, so pass for us, fine card though. If I was drafting someone else's cube and I had the option to draft this card, I'd probably take it and play it. I think it's perfectly fine. Hive Spine Wolverine is up next. This is 3 green for a 5/4 uncommon elemental Wolverine. When it enters, choose 1. Put a +1/+1 counter on target creature you control. Hive Spine Wolverine fights target creature token. And the third mode is destroy target artifact or enchantment. And I think it's honestly that third mode that like kind of sells it on me. It just gives it like a huge swath of utility to the point where like this card is never going to miss on something. And there is actually a ton of token making at the peasant level. Like every deck makes tokens, like even the control decks make tokens. So like the fight mode is narrow, but that's probably a good thing given the extra utility on this card. It can toss the +1 counter wherever, so it can be a 5-mana 6/5, which is okay. Not great, but okay. Or you can buff up another creature, and yeah, 5-mana 5/4 Reclamation Sage also seems like rock solid card. I like this. Does a lot of different things without being like super specific to any given deck.
When I first read this card, I don't know why, but I read it as destroy target enchantment, and I might be thinking of just like an actual different card. But the fact that it gets either one of them and kills tokens and can pump your board, your guys. I mean, obviously it's like, this is kind of one of those modal creatures where like, yeah, it's worse than Ridgescale Tusker on the first mode. It's worse than Agatha's Champion on the second mode. And the third mode, there's a number of different cards that do it, but the fact that it gets to do all three of these and they're all like kind of good. I think this is an example of where all the modes, you don't really know which one we're planning on clicking, but all of them are relevant enough at different times at a decent enough rate that I'm okay with it, even if there's not like a mode that I'm planning to click every time I cast this card.
This is good modality because like 5-mana 6/5 is already an okay starting point. Like if that's the default and I get to adjust that to do something else, that's pretty good. So I think this is just an example of great modality, especially because creature tokens are a heavy part of Peasant Cube, and also artifacts and enchantments tend to be, mostly enchantments, tend to be some of the more problematic, hard to deal with cards in cubes like ours. Think cards like Warlock class, Abiding Grace, Weaponize the Monsters that have given us trouble before because we didn't have a lot of incidental ways to actually get them off the board. Look what they did to my boy again.
Yeah, I mean, this is like beating the dead horse of Colossal Dreadmaw, right?
Beating the dead dino, as it were. Yeah, how many times can we make strict upgrades of Colossal Dreadmaw? Yeah, rarity shift, sure, but yeah, we're talking about Galewind Moose here, which just like Quake Tusk Boar is another, example of like, oh, let's go ahead and obsolete some old card that people like. But it's fine. It's 4 green for a 6/6 uncommon elemental elk with Flash, Vigilance, Reach, and Trample. And I think we can agree that the Reach is actually pretty... Actually, all of these keywords, like 6-mana 6/6 Trample is like, okay, that's fine, but every single keyword adds like a pretty significant layer to what this card can do.
Yeah, take what I said about the Charging Monstersaur upgrade being something that wasn't interesting and flip it. And this is what your green cards get. All of the modes on here just make this card increasingly good. I think we settled on not playing it, though I could see coming back around to that. It remains to be seen whether this card ends up in the cube or not.
Yeah.
But like the modes on this card are going to, even though it's really telegraphed, passing with 6 mana up, it's still what is your opponent gonna, this is like the Rattle Worm situation in OTJ, right? Like, what are you gonna do? Not attack?
Yeah, like, okay, I'll just flash this in and start attacking you with it. Like, even if you recognize your opponent has it, like if the only difference with you recognizing this is in your opponent hand is that you just like don't toss a creature into it, but you're still like incapable of making an attack that turn, like then the Galewind Moose is still doing its job. It didn't eat your thing, but it's still going to flash in and start bashing you, like, and it shuts down flyers. So it does get a knock in cube environments against savvy players, because if somebody has 6 green mana untapped and just passes the turn, I'm going to be like, okay, Like, I wonder what you could have. It's going to be pretty obvious, but it will catch people who aren't in the know off guard.
The real trick with this is to play it in your blue-green flash deck.
Yeah. Oh, man. I mean, I think this card gets there if you want to make room for it. I don't think it's the most interesting card, which is part of the reason we passed on it, but it should be a pretty strong card. I imagine this is going to do a lot of work in the retail limited set, but hey, it could be wrong. Maybe Colossal Dreadmaw doesn't hold up these days, even if it has 16 other keywords on it. But
yeah, I mean, it turns out four keywords is where I start getting interested in a French vanilla. 4 keywords that are all really synergistic with each other.
Yes, this plays offense and shuts down your opponent's blocks and lets you play at instant speed. That's a lot going on there. I will pass over the rest of the green creatures to you, because I think these are ones that you are generally more excited about, or at least ones that you brought to the table that I hadn't considered for our cube.
Okay. The next 2 we're actually including, and then I have a third one that we're not. So the first one that we are going to include is Sticky Tongue Sentinel. So this is 2 and a green for a 3/3 frog warrior with reach, and when it enters, you may return up to 1 other target permanent you control to its owner's hand. And anybody who knows me knows that Core Skyfisher is my favorite Magic card. And so this card is just a green Core Skyfisher. Can't do the bouncing itself to do things like that, but I think when you're spending 3 mana on this effect, you don't really want to do that.
And the rating is just Skyfisher.
Our tag for this one is just Skyfisher out of 10.
Skyfisher, yep.
Yeah, and so these effects always play really well at Peasant. They have a lot of nifty things. I really like it when it's a return target permanent you control. Mm-hmm. One of the downsides of the fairy, for example, is you can't pick up your MDFCs, and this absolutely can. I love when they can do that. This lets you pick up stuff like your A Killer Among Us, or your Hunter's Talent we'll talk about later, your fight spell that's on a permanent. And as Magic goes on, they stick more of those. We've got a Dustmorn preview or leak that came out that's like a flash enchantment it's the new -X small removal spell. It's like 2 mana for -3/-3 on an enchantment. So these are just effects that keep getting better over time, and I think like you can live a dream with them sometimes, but most of the time they're just good value. They can be a little awkward on occasion because they can be tempo negative, but I think most of the time these play out really well.
Yeah, it's really funny that it used to be the case that cards like that, Core Skyfisher and Emancipation Angel is another one, like those were way overstated creatures, but they came with a downside of having to return something, and obviously like you turn that into an upside to maximize the card. But now we're just getting like on rate creatures, and it's optional whether you want to do it or not, so it's just all upside. Like it's not even being disguised as a downside, it's just all upside. So 3 mana, 3/3 reach, not anything to write home about, but adding on a nice little value ability is nice. And green 3s have been really tough lately with so many cards like Contagious Vorak, Jewel Thief, Eldrazi Repurposer. There's just so many green 3s we could be playing, and we've actually had to start cutting good green 3s to get in new green 3s to try them out. So it's definitely a Teld card, but it should be a good Teld card at the very least.
Yep. So next up, I have Bakersbane Duo, which is 1 and a green for a 2/2. And when it enters, it makes a food token. It's a squirrel raccoon. And whenever you expend 4, Bakersbane Duo gets +1/+1 until end of turn. So this is not one that I think is going to be some sort of world wrecker, but we were bringing in the Bushy Bodyguard. And in general, our decks like to be able to make tokens. So we wanted to go ahead and try this over Herbology Instructor because it's got a little bit more synergy with some of the things that the tokens deck is doing, for example. And I think if you're able to expend 4 in a turn, I mean, this turns into a reasonably real card.
We should mention it because I think this is the only the first expend card from this review. Expend 4 means when you spend your 4th mana on spells for the turn, you've expended 4. So you cast a 4-drop or cast 2 2-drops. Like as soon as you spend mana number 4 in any given turn, that counts as expend 4.
Yeah, so I mean, savvy players will be able to set up lines where they'll get to skill check people with, or put situations where people, do you want to block or not? Because you play a 2-drop and then you attack, and maybe you have like a 2-mana removal spell for something, and then you trade up with your Bakersbane Duo. There's going to be a little bit of play to it. It's only +1/+1, so it's not like a huge deal there. Yeah. But yeah, I mean, 2-drop makes a game object, gives you a little bit of life padding if you need it. I think this is a solid card that synergizes with a couple of other cards that we've put into the cube in this update.
Yeah, definitely not a forever card. This is just like a nice little role player, but I kind of like it too. You sold me on it for sure. And Squirrel Raccoon is just great creature type. This is this is your Discord image right now of just this like really happy raccoon looking at a pie, and the squirrel's like, "Hey, look, a pie." The last one, I'll let you talk about it real quick, but this one was one that did not excite me. And maybe I'm wrong about it, but you go and take it.
Yeah, so this is Brambleguard Veteran. It's 1 green for a Raccoon Warrior that is a 3/4. And whenever you expend 4, it gets +1/+1 and gains Vigilance until end of turn.
Raccoons you control get +1/+1 and gain Vigilance.
Yes, for your Raccoon tribe.
For your Bakerbane's duo.
Of course. So this one I don't think is super exciting either, but it is kind of getting into stat monster territory if that's something you're interested in, right? If you're able to trigger this the turn after you play it, you get to make it into a 4/5 vigilance for 3 mana, and that is a really good rate. That being said, I mean, we kind of talked about how that's not going to be something you're able to do every turn. And overall, it's just not providing any extra value. So I don't think it's quite there, even as big as the stat line on this can get.
Yeah, it's kind of like the opposite. You talked already about how we're not huge fan of just like Mole Drifter creatures, like creatures that ETB and give you a card, like regardless of what the card is. Like we like them, but we just don't like an excess of them. And I'm also just like on the opposite end of that, not a huge fan of card that is just stats. Like obviously you have to play some amount of them, but that does lead to like these Gruul decks that are just playing a bunch of stat beasts that die to like efficient removal that's picking off all the stat beasts, and then they have no utility on their cards. So on top of this being a 1GG card, like I wasn't super sold on it, though I'll recognize like, if this is regularly, attacking as a 4/5 vigilance for 3 mana, that is a pretty good card. Maybe a little bit too narrow in which decks it goes in, maybe a little bit too restrictive on the mana cost. But I'm also like a little skeptical of how often expend 4 is actually just going to be a regular thing. Like on Bakersbane Duo, you don't really need to trigger the expend ability. It's nice when you do, but you don't really need that for the card to be justifiable. Whereas this one, I think you do kind of need to be expending 4 pretty much every turn. Otherwise, it's just going to drop off after that first big hit,
Yeah, I agree. I think when it comes to stat monsters, I mean, the only ones that really get there on raw stats in our cube is like Colossidactyl, right? I think that's the only true stat monster we run that has no other utility. I mean, and that card is just massive on top of having good defensive and offensive utility, so.
Mm-hmm. Also, its name is Colossidactyl, so it gets past.
Yeah, it does.
Spells in green. We've got a new combat trick here. We do love our good combat tricks here at Jank Diver Game. And Overprotect is a 1 in a green for an uncommon instant. Target creature you control gets +3/+3 and gains trample, hexproof, and indestructible until end of turn. So we're talking like a massive might kind of combat trick that's going to push through and deal damage on offense, but you can also just fire it off on defense and save a creature. 2 mana is a lot for that on defense, but that's kind of the secondary mode. That's just the added utility of a card. Like we're not playing +3/+3 and trample for 2 mana, but I think the defensive mode kind of pushes it over to the top, where this is a flexible little role player that we're going to play. And it also just so happens that we've talked about cutting Tyvar's stand due to just how efficient that card has been, and this feels like just a like perfect replacement, maybe a little more appropriate while still being pretty strong.
Yeah, if you've been following what's going on in the main cube, Tyvar's Stand is one of the best green cards there. And here at Peasant, obviously, it isn't protecting as powerful of a creature, but because of the way Peasant is more combat oriented, a lot of times Tyvar's Stand just creates that same spot of your opponent has 1 mana available and you have to do something that involves them blowing you out with Tyvar's Stand. And it just happens draft in, draft out, to the point that we're just kind of like, all right, well, maybe this card's a little too good. And this card comes in and was a really timely print, I think. Mm-hmm. Obviously, if we just wanted to have a defensive card, we could run something like Tamio's Safekeeping or what is it, Royal Treatment, I believe is the name of it.
Yeah.
So we could run something like that, and those would be worse versions than Tyvar's Stand, but we're going to go ahead and try this one because we like when our combat tricks play that double duty if they can. We do really like that.
I love the flavor text here. Like, it's this frog who's like boasting. He's like, Blor's defenses are impervious, and then it's quoted to Blor the impervious.
That's awesome. Yeah.
Good. Next one's a real quick one because I had this labeled as like a flexible test card, but I think it's actually just like a not for us card. But Peerless Recycling is 1 in a green for an uncommon instant with gift a card. It returns a permanent from your graveyard to your hand, and if you promise the gift, you return 2 permanents from your graveyard to your hand. And it's the type of card that, like, I think there's really high upside here, like 2-mana instant, get back 2 permanents, like my best 2 things in the graveyard. That can swing a game for sure, especially if you're like, you know, cycling your Troll of Khazad-dûm and then getting it back later in the game and stuff like that, or God forbid, your Hollow Marauder. But I also think it's the type of card where it's like, we don't need to play this. Like, we have so much recursion already across a lot of different colors that we don't need it. So I didn't want to ignore 2-mana double regrowth at instant speed. Still skeptical of gift a card and how that's going to play out. But I think this is like a, we don't need to play this card, but I recognize there's some power here. So I wanted to bring it up.
I think in your green decks, you're more likely to want to gift this because I think your average draw, given the power and cost of some of the creatures in your deck, are going to beat what your opponents are doing. But this is one of those spots where it does kind of remain to be seen. I mean, instep, do this, gift a card, pick up like a 3 and a 4 drop or a 4 or 2 4s or something, and then have the mana to cast them on your turn is going to put you really far ahead. So because there's no rats in Peasant, it could be enough that like it doesn't matter that you give your opponent a card. You're just so far ahead that you're just going to win the game.
Mm-hmm. Oh, you know what? I actually just figured it out. We're Peerless recycling back our Pinnacle Monk, and we're just going to loop it, and we're going to gift a card so many times that we mill our opponent out. Like, we're going to force draw them.
Okay. Yeah. I like it.
Talk to me about this next one, because we got another Forever card here. Spoiler alert.
Yeah, so I referenced this card earlier. This is Hunter's Talent. This is 1 in a green for a enchantment class, and when it ETBs, a target creature you control deals damage to its power to target creature you don't control. For 1 in a green, you can level it to 2, and whenever you attack, target attacking creature gets +1/+0 and trample until end of turn. And then for 3 in a green, you can take it to level 3, where at the beginning of your end step, if you control a creature with power 4 or greater, you draw a card. They've been printing Rabid Bites with various levels of upside. Sometimes it's instant plus some stuff, and sometimes it's stats, that sort of thing. The upside on this one is they gave you an entire engine. Like, this is a game plan. Mm-hmm. This card is wild.
Yeah, this is the clear, like, it's funny when we look at the other classes. We talked about the Bandit one and how, like, it's not even close to playable in most cubes. And then this one's just like, you know what? Here's a good effect with, like, this massive upside, and it's an uncommon. Like,
yeah, the wild thing too is all of these levels of upside scale in the way you want them to scale into the game, and also synergize with each other. This is the same way that like Rangers Clash just happens to level up perfectly and so smoothly that you can tell it was a well-designed card. This is what these classes I was hoping were going to look like. Is this just like, this isn't broken, right? I don't think this card is going to be taking over a cube.
It's enough mana investment that I can't imagine it's broken, but it's certainly pushed for the uncommon class here.
Sure, and I didn't expect all of them to be literally this good, but I did expect the designs to look more like this, where it's doing a thing that the color like actively wants to do, the decks are going to want to do, kind of regardless of what they're doing. And then it has good level ups that have good value later into the game, which is exactly what you want your classes to do. And I think this is the only class that really got there.
Yeah, I could see this definitely being just like Prey Upon for the first level, you know, but it's just actually Rabid Bite. Like, they didn't really sacrifice anything. And Rabid Bite doesn't really get there because now we're playing with cards like Horrific Assault and hard-hitting Question. Like, they've clearly pushed Rabid Bite beyond just 2-mana punch a thing, but like when you just tack on a bunch of extra upside to it later in the game, like, sure, I'll play Rabid Bite that eventually draws me 2 cards and gives a creature trample every time I attack. Like, yeah, I'll take that.
Yeah, this is best card best class in the set, and it's not close. It's across all rarities outside of maybe one of the classes has some sort of constructed thing, but for general cube where you're playing just normal cards, this is the best class in the set.
100%. Forever card there. Close out green for us. You've added 2 or 3 other cards to green that it looks like you want to talk about here.
Yeah, I'm going to move pretty quickly for these because they're all not for us. I just thought they were interesting. So the first one is Heaped Harvest. It's 2 and a green for a artifact food. And when it ETBs or you sacrifice it, you may search your library for a basic land and put it onto the battlefield tapped and then shuffle. And then it has the food text to pay 2 and sack it to gain 3 life. So this is not for us, obviously, but it is kind of cool if you've got artifact sack stuff, if you're supporting, I don't know if this is like an Affinity Cube card necessarily.
Yep,
maybe,
it's in there.
Yeah. So yeah, like if you've got things to sack this where you can go do something else, like bargain it away other than have to play it for the food, this is like
forage.
It's 2 lands wrapped up in 1, which is it's pretty good value for 3 mana when you get all of that plus some upside. So just a nice little value engine card for some other environments. Mm-hmm. So next up, there's Wear Down, which is 1 and a green for a sorcery, destroy target artifact or enchantment, and you can gift a card. If you promise them a gift, you instead destroy 2 artifacts or enchantments. Speaking of the Affinity Cube, this is kind of cracked there, right? It's like
this is way too good for Affinity Cube. 2 mana, kill 2 things sure. That's brutal.
But I expect in high artifacts enchantment environments, like I could see this is the kind of card that if this ended up in a vintage cube or something of that power level, it wouldn't surprise me. It's not for us, but for those artifact and enchantment heavy environments, this is really good.
I will say on this one, this is actually a card that I'm off topic a little. I'm actually excited for this card in Commander because you can like politic with gift a card and just give it to like somebody who's like buddying up with you and then just pop 2 artifacts or enchantments, which is still very good for 2 mana.
Oh, sure. Yeah, I think actually now that you mentioned, I think Persian mentioned something about this being a exciting card for CEDH.
I could believe it. Yeah.
Yeah, and then the last one is Stocking the Pantry. It's a single green for an enchantment, and when you put 1 or more +1/+1 counters on a creature you control, you put a supply counter on Stocking the Pantry, and then you can pay 2 and remove a supply counter from this card to draw a card. Not for us, but it's a cool little value engine if you do the +1/+1 counter thing. Like, this is the kind of card that could be, you play it, it's super cheap, so you can play it on turn 1 or really early into the game, and then as you stack counters on creatures, you're going to be able to keep making sure you don't run out of gas, which helps with the fact that deck tends to be a glass cannon deck in most environments.
Mm-hmm. We shifted our cube from Selesnya +1/+1 counters a while back now to the point where like this just doesn't fit the context of our cube at all, but that's certainly a theme that people support in a lot of different color pairs in their cubes, and maybe even Mops like Proliferate Cube. This is the type of card that he'll slot in. I'm sure he will too, because like you can proliferate the supply counters on top of +1/+1 counter, so it seems like it does some cool stuff, but it's a lot like that Metastatic Evangel card in terms of like doesn't really fit what our cube is doing, but I recognize there's cubes out there where this is probably a cool card.
Yeah. Also, I really love the art. It's got this very it's a different aesthetic than a lot of the other arts in the set. It's very, what's the word, like sketch cartoon?
Oh yeah. Okay.
Whimsical, yeah, something like that. Yeah. Like, I don't know. I just really like it. It's a squirrel stocking up his pantry. He's just carrying.
Yeah, there's just like a bunch of skulls in between the nuts and stuff too.
Yeah, it's great because they're all necromancer squirrels. Mm-hmm. So yeah, I love it. It's great art.
Yeah, that's a fun one. That moves us into gold. We'll talk about gold cards and then a couple colorless cards here, but we're gonna kick off with Burrow Guard Mentor. This is white-green for a star uncommon rabbit soldier. It has trample, and its power and toughness are each equal to the number of creatures you control, including itself. So 1/1 trample minimum, and then bigger from there. This is an archetypal card through and through. We're actually still playing Shauna Sisay's Legacy, which is, doesn't have trample, but has like some weird trinket text about can't be targeted by ability, so it like can't be Ravenous Chupacabra or whatever. I think like first off that text doesn't actually matter that much. It does come up occasionally, but it's not a selling point of the card. But throwing trample on this is great, I think, because Shauna does become like a 6/6, 7/7, 8/8 some amount of the time, even bigger in the really dedicated token decks, but it just gets chump blocked so easily, and this solves that problem. So I like this as just a pretty much direct replacement for Shauna.
Yeah, pretty minor thing aside. I think if this card loses its abilities, it still keeps its stats, right?
When power and toughness are each equal. No, it'll just die.
Oh, okay. I thought Star was I thought Star meant it was like innate, and because Shauna's a 0/0 that gets +1/+1 for each of them, so I knew it would die if it lost all of its abilities. Yeah. I wasn't sure on this one.
No, Star is tied to, like, the ability defines what Star is, so if the ability is gone, then Star is replaced by 0/0, so it'll just die.
Okay, so the only minor downside of this card is that you cannot Vesper Lark it back for whatever that is worth.
Yes, it will be like a giant creature in your graveyard, unless it's a 1/1, unless Vesper Lark was the only creature you controlled or something, maybe.
Yeah, but I mean, 99% of the time, this is going to be better than Shauna. There's a few niche cases, but yeah, most of the time, Trample is going to be way better.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a nice one. The next one is a test card. A lot of these gold cards end up being like archetypal cards because that's just the design of our Peasant Cube, but every now and then there are some like kind of open-ended cards worth talking about here, which is the case with Fireglass Mentor. This is black-red for a 2/1 uncommon Wizard Warlock. At the beginning of your second main phase, if an opponent lost life, you exile the top 2 of your library, choose one of them, and you may play that card until the end of this turn, so no carrying it over to the next turn. Black-red 2-drops, no shortage of those. We've got things like Blood Tithe Harvester and Zoyawa from Lost Caverns of Ixalan, and those cards I think are both meaningfully better than this, though this is very similar to that Otter, the 3-mana Otter we talked about, where it's an uncommon that can potentially draw you like a card every turn. So I don't want to ignore it, but it does feel like it's missing a keyword or something that actually gets the train rolling, because it's really relying on your other cards to do the thing.
Yeah, I think this is a card we're going to test, but it's hard. It's hard to find space to fit this in, right? Because you go like 1-drop, 2-drop, turn 3, you play this, and maybe you get to spike a land if you're lucky. But even then, you gave up casting a 3-drop early into the game. After turn 4, it starts to become a little easier, and you start having more mana available to you to gain that, but it becomes harder to deal combat damage. We're going to try this one, but I could see this one being kind of a stinker, even though it reads quite good. It's also just a super anemic stat line.
Yeah, this is the definition of a test card. We're not sure where it's going to land, but we're going to try it out and see. Pond Prophet is next. This is just a very easy not for us card. It's a double Simic hybrid mana, so 2 mana for a 1/1, and when it enters, draw a card. So kind of like a worse Elvish Visionary, like a harder to cast Elvish Visionary, but people do love these cards. People love their cantrip creatures, so I feel like someone would mention it if we didn't mention it here.
Yeah, I was watching the set review for, I think it was limited level ups, and they were talking about this card and how, like, because it's Simic, people will, pass them a little later, and as the frog deck, you'll be able to get them like 6th pick. And I'm just like, I don't know if you know the average Magic the Gathering arena player who you'll be drafting with, but this is not, you're not getting the 6th pick very often. I don't think the people just like,
it's certainly not worth a gold slot in a cube like ours.
Yeah, it was just really funny because they were just really optimistic that Simic mana cost was going to keep people from taking it and splashing it. And no, people in their green or blue deck would just take this card and they'll jam it in even if it's not likely to cast.
Stormcatch Mentor's up next. This is a weird one. It's blue-red for a 1/1 uncommon Otter Wizard. It has haste, prowess, and your instants and sorceries cost 1 less to cast. So an archetypal card through and through for Izzet spells, and the immediate comparison is Goblin Electromancer, 2 mana 2/2 that makes your instants and sorceries cost 1 less. Like, we talk about this pretty extensively. Are we wrong in thinking that this is just worse than Goblin Electromancer? Like, 1/1 haste, like, you peck in, you deal damage, sure, and then it gets brick walled. Are you really, like, flurrying out a bunch of spells to make this consistently better than a 2/2? And if you're using a combat trick like Monstrous Rage, all it does is bump it up with prowess to where Goblin Electromancer would be anyway. So I'm not really seeing it. I don't... It has that Otter thing you were talking about where it feels like the stats were pushed down to a point where, like, it actually makes the cards pretty weak.
Yeah, I'm actually really concerned for the main set because, like, maybe I'm wrong and maybe Otters end up being really good, but it feels like so many of them are so small. And I kind of wonder, I'm assuming at testing at some point, this card said instant sorceries and Otters you control cost 1 less to cast, and that was broken. I'm actually confused why this card has it doesn't really, I don't know, like in the terms of cube, like Goblin Electromancer, I think is better most of the time. Haste doesn't matter on this card, right? It doesn't tap for mana. It doesn't have any sort of tap ability. And like, if you play it on turn 2, maybe you squeeze in a point of damage, but when else are you casting this and you've got enough mana to cast a bunch of spells to prowess it up? Prowess is really good, but prowess is good because you can trigger it once or twice and be really powerful. This card just does not get there. It feels just so anemic. I'm almost positive this card's going to be bad.
Yeah, all the otter cards feel like they were designed with the intention of you casting like 2 to 3 spells per turn, which is just not how limited Magic really pays out. So maybe Otters was like really designed with constructed in mind, and that makes the cards look like they don't translate to limited as well, which, you know, vicariously means they're not great cube cards. But yeah, I think I'm on board with saying Stormcatch Mentor is weaker than Goblin Electromancer, which feels backwards. Like, maybe I'm wrong. Yeah. I'm willing to entertain that I'm wrong.
Yeah, weird design. I don't, not in love with this, but we'll see. The next up is Plume Creed Mentor. It's 1 white blue for a 2/3 flying bird scout. Whenever it or another creature you control with flying enters, you may put a +1/+1 counter on target creature you control without flying. So by itself, this is a 2/3 that comes down and pumps something, kind of airy auxiliary style. Does have to have no flying on it, but most of your creatures early into the game, in white at least, will not have flying. And then if you're able to play other flying creatures, obviously it starts throwing around a bunch of counters and kind of becomes an engine card your opponent needs to get rid of. If you're playing cards like Battle Screech or Whirler Rogue, they get really, really good with this card because they provide so many triggers, and Whirler Rogue also just gives you the non-flying creature to go with it. But I actually think this card's just kind of generally pretty good if you're doing kind of the nondescript blue-white tempo flyers thing as one of your archetypes.
Yeah, we used to have blue-white as flyers in like the original build of our Peasant Cube, and we found it to be like just a little bit too streamlined and not even necessarily broken, but like it just, once you're in the deck, like you basically have no agency in the draft. You just take cards with flying. It is very weird that some of the birds in this set are like, put a bunch of birds and flying creatures in your deck, but also put a bunch of non-bird, non-flying creatures in your deck, which leads me to believe like that archetype is just going to flounder too much in limited. Plus, like if you're actually playing blue-white birds or blue-white flyers in your cube, you're usually using gold slots on things like Empyrean Eagle and, you know, Watcher of the Sphere and like the go-to gold uncommon like flying payoffs, to the point where like you want your deck to be pretty much all flyers if you can make it. So like I'm not sure where this stands. Like this feels like a blue-white flyers card that isn't really for a blue-white flying deck. Like Whirler Rogue is a great example. You want basically non-flying creatures that also generate a flying creature rather than a deck full of flyers or a deck full of non-flyers. And maybe like just blue-white tempo with a bunch of ground dorks, and this is like one of your only flying creatures. Maybe that's good enough, but that's just not how blue-white ends up being. So it's a little bit of a weird design and like design space for blue-white flyers to care about non-flying creatures, but there is upside to this card. I just think like I'm not sure when you would slot it into a cube if you have a flying theme.
Yeah, I think if you're fully maximizing this card, it feels like it's approaching that sort of rosy cotton red flag territory, though.
Yeah, I mean every piece of cardboard you're putting on board is like distributing a +1/+1 counter somewhere. So I see the upside of it. I'm just, the deck construction to make it tick is just very strange. You would need a lot of cards like Whirler Rogue and Old Tech Cloud Guard, you know, basically have a ground creature and a flying creature in one card, but there's not a ton that really fits that bill, I don't think. Fits that bill, get it?
Yeah. Tim, on this next card I need to mention, I actually used my powers of reading to realize that I misread it when I first pitched it to you anyway, so I'm glad we didn't decide to include this card.
Okay, are we still reading it here though?
Yeah, we're going to talk about it. So the next up is Tidecaller Mentor. It's 1 blue-black for a 3/3 menace rat wizard, and it has Threshold. When it enters, if 7 or more cards are in your graveyard, return up to 1 target non-land permanent to its owner's hand. So it actually makes a lot more sense that it does this. But when I first read this card, I thought it said I thought it had Threshold, return a non-land permanent card from your graveyard to your hand.
I misread that the same way too, which I was like, that's a weird blue-black card, but okay.
Yeah, exactly. I was like, okay, well, it's some sweet value later into the game, and it's weird it's on an aggressive body. The whole package now makes a lot more sense, but I do think it's weaker. So
yeah, I mean, this is just a well-statted combat-oriented mana war if you get to Threshold, right?
Yeah. It'll be a totally decent card if you want to include it. If you're doing like ninjas or something like that, or you need something to fill it out because there aren't enough gold cards, or if you're doing like blue-black tempo, it's totally serviceable card, decent stat line, decent effect later into the game. I just thought it was like actually a weird value card that also wanted to be aggressive, which is why I had pitched it as like interesting to talk about. Much less interesting to talk about, but much more cohesive in terms of what it does.
Yeah, just blue-black Eternal Witness on a 3/3 menace.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, this is easily a not for us card on account of our blue-black section being this really tight, like, spells matters kind of thing going on. But I could see a world where this gets there. Wondertail Mentor is up next. It's red-green for a 2/2 uncommon Raccoon Bard. When you expend 4, put a +1/+1 counter on it, and it taps to add red or green. So another card that's very similar to, like, Ruby from Wilds of Eldraine, like a 2-mana dork in red and green that also has like an ability that makes it more relevant in combat later on. We both like this card. We do think, or at least I think, correct me if I'm wrong, I don't want to speak for you, but I think that this card is worse than Goblin and Narcomancer, which is the 2-mana 2/2 that reduces the cost of red and green spells by 1. I think it's worse than that, but given the context of our cube right now and how our Gruul section is actually built out with like things like Chrysalis and Eatskinth, Wondertail Mentor actually works better than a Narcomancer with our current Gruul card. So we're playing it over a Narcomancer. That comparison aside, I still just think this is a rock solid card, right? Because it's a 2-mana 2/2 that gets you to the 4-drop that then turns it into a 3/3. So by the time you're untapping for turn 4, you presumably have like a 4-mana creature and a 3/3, and you could even cast a 5-drop that turn. So this is a good use of expend on a mana dork, and I like that this can just kind of contribute to the ramp game plan and then actually just start beating down later.
So one of the things that happens when you go from Peasant to the main cube or the main cube to Peasant is I think the individual card qualities matters a lot more at Peasant than it does in the main cube in a weird way, where like a Narcomancer being kind of a card that doesn't do anything on its own, like mana dorks in general. When your card that you're casting is a Vorinclex, or you're casting like 2 really powerful 3-drops, on turn 4 off of the Narcomancer, and you're doing really, really broken things with the mana, the card that you cast outpaces the resource investment. But I think here in these lower power environments, the cards, the mana dorks that have some scaling help offset the fact that, something like Llanowar Elves, I think, gets a lot weaker in Peasant, even if it's still a good card, because you're never going to cast something that so overwhelms the game that it makes up for the fact that you put a 1-mana 1/1 dead draw into your deck, if that makes sense. So I like that this scales up. You trigger it once, it's going to be a 3/3. It'll trade with things. And the wild spell turns aren't quite as important here. And then obviously it plays worse in this environment because we have 2 cards of our gold section don't work with an Archimancer at all.
Yep, that's a test card, although I guess it's more likely just archetype card. Like, it's just a Gruul card that does Gruul things, so.
All right, I would like to talk about the next one if you're okay with it.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so this might be my favorite card in the set. It's Vinereap Mentor. It's green-black for a 3/2 Squirrel Druid, and when it enters or dies, create a food token. I love Minstrosity, and man, this is way better than Minstrosity.
I love a clean text box.
Yeah. Gosh, this card is awesome if you've gotten on board with the rectangle theory. Like, this is just making 3 game objects, right? It's not really doing anything in our cube in terms of what our green black section is doing, but green black food is supported in the standard cube, and this is going to be going right in as one of the big enablers for that deck. And I think I've mentioned this earlier in the podcast. You'll have to forgive us if I've forgotten. We did half the recording yesterday, but we're getting close enough to a density that I actually think green black food is starting to look like a somewhat real archetype, even in this regular powered Peasant environment. There are quite a number of good green black signal cards for food at this point.
So what you're saying is Bone Cash Mentor gets there.
Of course, yeah. I mean, this triggers it twice. How could it not?
I like this card. I like how simple it is, and you know, if you're not using the food for anything specific, like when all is said and done, you are paying 6 mana, but you're paying a single card for 3, 2, and 6 life. So that's already a good starting point. And then, like we've mentioned already, the goal is not to crack the food for life. It's to use it to feed your other cards, like your Eviscerator's Insights and stuff. So I am a little, I guess I'm not surprised, but it is interesting that they made this a 3/2. They could have very easily have just made it like a slightly weaker creature. Is this green-black's Blood Tithe Harvester? maybe not as good, but
obviously it's not as good. But yeah, I think this card is really solid. I mean, it's 2 mana 3/2 with multiple layers of upside, makes 3 game objects. What's not to love?
Yeah. So hashtag not for us, but like not for us for now? Question mark.
Yeah. Question mark. Yeah.
One more gold card to talk about here. Pretty simple one. Head of the Homestead. This is 3 and then double Selesnya hybrid mana. So 5 mana total for a 3/2 common Rabbit Citizen. When it enters the battlefield, make 2 1/1 rabbit creature tokens. It's 5/4 across 3 bodies for 5 mana. It's a card. it's an unexciting card, but I think it's rather good. Like obviously token synergy, but it's also just a good card to blink or pick up and recast and stuff like that. Three bodies for 5 mana is a little inefficient when you compare this to something like Hop to It, which is 3 bodies for 3 mana, but the fact that the creature carries this ability does mean that there's more opportunity for like shenanigans with it. So It also, as I mentioned to you, cards like this make it like just blow my mind that Cloud Goat Ranger was ever printed like as a card, because like this is a 2024 card. Cloud Goat Ranger was printed in like 2008 or something like that.
Yeah, what an unbelievable bomb that would have that card is. You could put that into a modern limited format and it would still just break the format in half.
Yep.
Yeah, this card's fine. It's like it's kind of hard to be mad at it or anything. I don't think it's really competing on rate with some of the better versions of these effects. But the fact that you can play it in a green or a white deck or your Selesnya deck, I think gives it the flexibility that makes us want to include it. Though, like I do think it's probably worse than just casting a Killer Among Us or Imperial Oath on average. You can blink it though, which is pretty nice. You can pick it up, of course, Skyfisher, obviously, or Sticky Tongue Sentinel. Yeah. The other thing is, I know I've mentioned this a ton across this set review, but man, the art on this card is great. It looks like something out of a like an old storybook, like the ones you'd read as kids. It just
like a Peter Cottontail thing.
Yeah. This set just they stuck the whimsy back in Magic, and it is great
for one set, and then we're all universes beyond next year. So like savor this set while we can. This is the last frontier of good Magic design. It is worth noting too, from our own personal cube perspective, that our Selesnya section was kind of like a hodgepodge of tokens, like thematic cards, and then just kind of like effects, like generic effects like Buried in the Garden. And we have been on the lookout for just like a good tokens card, like a good signal card, and this kind of fits the bill. So like this won't be around forever. It's not the most exciting thing in the world, but it's kind of like in line with what we were looking for already for our section.
Yeah. So we have a couple of colorless cards. So we have Strictly Better Traveler's Amulet. So there's Fountainport Bell, which is 1 mana, colorless, for an artifact, and when it enters the battlefield, you may search your library for a basic land card, reveal it, shuffle, put the card on top, and then you can pay 1 and sack it to draw a card. So a couple of things that I really like about this card, and let me double check. I think we decided, we decide not to include this? Okay, I couldn't remember if we decided to include this or not.
I don't think we did, but we could. It's fine. It's not like if we were already on Traveler's Amulet, yeah, we would absolutely have played this, but we're already not on Amulet.
Yeah, so I don't actually know if this is worth a cube slot, but it has a couple of really nice edges over Traveler's Amulet. First being that obviously later into the game, you could just decline to reveal, and you can just cycle this for 2 mana and draw a card. Another thing is if you play this on turn 1, you draw your land immediately, meaning you get to cast a 2-drop. So one of the problems with Traveler's Amulet is you play it on 1 and then have to crack it on 2, and you would not be able to cast your 2-drop. So this lets you more smoothly just play out your hand when you need the land, and then also finds you more gas later into the game, kind of giving it not Mishra's Bauble vibes, because that card is so cheap and efficient and does everything, but like it is much closer to just being like a good grease the wheels kind of card rather than something like Traveler's Amulet that plays a very, very niche role. I think this is much more flexible, and it's much less of a waste of a cube slot, even though it is still a minor effect.
Yeah, I'm actually not sure like where it would stack up against something like Wayfarer's Bauble, for example, because that one actually ramps you. But I've heard some people poo-poo in this card, and sure, in retail limited it might not be good enough. Maybe in cube it's still just like not an effect you need. But just to kind of like frame the card, think of it as 2 colorless mana to draw a land from your deck. Like that's kind of the base point. Don't really think about it in terms of like those Dune Mover, like the silver deputy kind of cards that like come down and replace your draw step with a land. Like it does that when you need it to do that, but this is as a baseline 2 mana to just go fetch up a basic and put it in your hand. And then obviously like the way it's templated gives you a little more flexibility over that. And I think if you think about it that way, it feels a little bit better. It's still, even that being said, like it still might not be the type of card you would make room for like in a cube if you're not already playing cards like Traveler's Amulet.
Yeah, I think the really awkward thing about this card is that the colors that would be interested in using it care that it is not a creature / spell, depending on which one we're talking about. But yeah, I just wanted to mention it because I think it's like a noticeable upgrade over that effect, and I think it's one of the better of these like super cheap trinkety artifact things that just mostly cycle but do something a little bit better than that.
Yeah, I like the design. I don't think it's actually that great of a card, but I do like the kind of kajiggering of things that they've done here to a normal Traveler's Amulet style card.
Oh, we also need to talk about the Tumbler. We forgot to talk about that.
Which one?
The Tangle Tumbler.
Oh, yeah. Well, why don't you go ahead and talk about Bramble. Why don't you talk about this pot card here, and I'll go ahead and look up the Tumbler and add it to the notes after that.
Sure. So this is Bumbleflower's Share Pot. So it's
sure. Yeah. Okay. Say that again.
Bumbleflower's Share Pot. Yeah. Okay. All right. 2 mana, and it's an artifact that when it enters, it makes a food token, and you can pay 5, tap and sack it, destroy target non-land permanent, activate as a sorcery. They keep pushing these effects. I mean, this one spots you a game object. Like we've mentioned a bunch about what you can do with a food, and this set adds more things to do with it. I don't think this is playable, but they keep turning the knob on this, and one day they're going to hit it, right? Like they inevitably, if they make this card over the next 10 sets, which they seem to like push, they seem like they want to do that.
What was the last one?
It was the horseshoe one at OTJ.
There was that one. There was also Urn of Godfire from March of the Machine, which like filtered mana very poorly, but you could pay 6 mana to sack it and destroy something.
The Luris Companion combo piece, right?
Yes, exactly. So like they pushed it down to 5 mana now, and it's like, okay, can we get this down to like 3 maybe, and then we'll start talking about it. But it feels like they're like turning the knob on the colorless artifact removal spell that's mandatory in every set now.
Yeah. By 2027, we'll have one that we can talk about.
Yeah, so that's Bumbleflower's Paw of Goodness or whatever. Last colorless card to talk about here. Very weird one. This is Tangle Tumbler. It's 3 colorless mana for a 6/6 uncommon vehicle. It has Vigilance. It has 3 and tap it, put a +1/+1 counter on target creature. Notably, you can do that if it's not crewed or whatever. And then it doesn't actually have a crew cost, but it says tap 2 untapped tokens to turn it into an artifact creature for the turn. So crew using 2 artifact tokens, or rather 2 tokens. And it doesn't have to be creature tokens, so you can tap like 2 food to make this a thing. I don't really get this card's role in the main set other than like they probably just started out with the idea of like, what if we had a vehicle that was a bunch of like raccoons and tumble, like I don't know, I don't really get the card, but the potential of like a 3 mana 6/6 vigilance that all you have to do is tap some like random game objects you're not using, there's potential there. The activated ability is obviously like a bit too expensive to be a real draw for the card, but if you care about the stats enough already, like that's just upside. So I'm not like really sold on this, but the numbers seem like they're in the right place.
Yeah, it's hard to look down, or it's hard to turn down like 3 mana 6/6 vigilance with upside, right? Like you have to try it. You can't not.
Yeah, I mean, usually if I'm going to be excited about a 6/6 with Vigilance, it also needs to be 4 green and have Flash, Trample, and Reach as well. But like, they can't all be that. They can't all be that. So this is such a weird card.
Well, when I trophy with an Abzan tokens deck with food and rabbits, with this card in the deck, I will send you a picture of it for the trophy deck list. But no, I think this card is pretty interesting. Like, obviously you can do food, you can do tokens like off Thraben Inspector. You can tap your clue token, right? And so there's enough cards, especially in white, I think, to make this work. And then it's a pretty oversized creature. And if you're tapping non-creature game objects, especially, like, we're really generating a lot of stats out of nowhere. And then on top of that, we can use it on offense and defense as long as we still have things to tap. And when we attack with it, it makes our attacks better, because after we've declared our attacks, any block our opponent makes, if we have the 3 mana up, has to accommodate the fact that we can make a creature bigger. I mean, there's just a lot to like here. Like, I can see this card sucking, but also the numbers are in such a way that I'm kind of like, all right, well, I can see the dream, if nothing else.
Yeah, I mean, for me, it's test card incarnate, right? Because we have flexibility in our colors section. We always do. So, like, when a card like this comes along and, like, one of us is, I see some potential here. Like, we have the room to try it out. But I wouldn't be particularly shocked if this card either sucks or people look at it and, like, don't put together what decks it could go in and just never draft it or play it. But I also wouldn't be too surprised if it, like, just starts beating down on turn 4 and, actually, like, proves itself to be a pretty strong card. So I don't know where I land on it. It's just such a weird design. It doesn't feel like it's really playing into anything that's going on in the set outside of, like, saying the word tokens on it a couple of times. But it is a 6/6 for 3 when you get it going.
Oh,
so.
no, I've got it,
Oh,
Tim.
boy. Yes.
All right, so we've got our base Abzan deck, right? But we're gonna splash for for Valiant Mice. Yeah, we're gonna splash for Valiant Mice, and then we're gonna use the tokens to turn this on, and then we're gonna trigger Valiant during our combat step with this trigger.
Oh wow! You solved it. Good job. You did it.
Yeah, this is not a card that if you asked me to bet money on a card, like would I put money on this card being in the cube, next set or a year from now? I would not put money on it. But also these are the kind of spots where, this is like an easy include, because our as you mentioned, our colorless section always has room because the colorless cards are just not important. So yeah, anytime we get an effect like this, and in general with this cube and the main cube, if one of us is really, really interested in it and the other two don't really care, or in this case, if one of us is really interested in it and the other one doesn't care, we usually try it out just to see, because sometimes we all have eyes for different kinds of cards, and sometimes we're right, sometimes we're wrong. So I mean, that's part of the fun of cube design, actually.
That's the Tonk method in action. Try out the new card, TONC, the Tonk method. If one person wants to try something bad enough, we'll usually try it even if the other person doesn't care that much. So that does put a wrap on things. And again, just kind of like the Modern Horizons 3 thing, there's probably more cards we could have pulled out and talked about. This one's a little bit less like in your face in terms of like the cards that are really good compared to Modern Horizons 3, but this is probably more in line with what we can expect for Peasant Cube reviews. I will say the card I love most from the set is Bone Cache Overseer, and even though like it doesn't feel like it fits in our cube, I'm going to keep my eye on this guy because I just really love the design of the card. And then the big question mark card for me right now is the 6-mana Otter, the Daring Wave Rider, as far as like, is this card, what is the regular use case for this card? How good does it end up being? So that's where I'm at. I don't know if you have any favorites or question mark cards that you're excited to try out or see where they land.
Yeah, I continue to just really love anything that makes a food. Like I'm really on this let's make food and then find things to do with them. I can't get enough of it. So I really like Savor and the Bone Reap Mentor, and all the forage cards are really cool. The one I have the most question marks about, I think it is the Tangle Tumbler, because I keep looking at it and I'm like, man, that's a lot of stats. And I'm like, but it's a pretty big hurdle, but man, it's a lot of stats.
Yeah, Heartfire Mentors or Heartfire Hero is also on my list of like, let's see how this one does. I'm excited for it. I have high hopes for it, but we'll see where it lands.
Yeah, is this card awful or amazing?
I'm gonna lean towards amazing. Like to borrow Lords of Limited's Greater Garbage. I believe this card is great. Okay, any closing thoughts? Again, we probably did like actual set closing thoughts on the mainline cube, so we don't have to do that here. But as far as Peasant Cube goes, any final thoughts before we wrap up?
I just, I know the modern era, I think I say this every set, but the modern era of Magic design has led to some really wacky things happening constructed that are not fun. But these limited designs just keep getting more interesting. They keep pushing boundaries on old card designs to keep trying to find new things. And I just, I like to throw praise where it is due, because I know I criticize WotC a lot, but this set feels like the designs were really crisp. They were not overly complicated for the most part, and they just seem to be cool, fun designs that aren't brain-breaking to parse through.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. This is probably the set I've been most excited about this year, and I think they really nailed it in terms of what the expectations were. As far as like individual cards go, we'll find out down the line, but as far as like the feel of the set and everything, I couldn't have been happier with the way that this has turned out. But with that being said, let's go ahead and wrap up here. So thanks as always to everyone listening. Remember, the best way to support Jank Diver Gaming and the Jank Tank podcast is to join the Discord server and come draft with us, give us your feedback. It's a great place to hang out with like-minded individuals and talk about Cube, Retail Limited, especially when a new set comes out. I'm sure we will have people streaming their first couple drafts at least in the Discord server, and it's always fun to get people kind of shouting about what they think the correct picks are. Think of the Jank Diver Gaming Discord as your online LGS. You can find links to our Discord wherever you're listening to this podcast. You can come join our scheduled drafts up to 4 days a week. We have the mainline cube drafts on Sunday and Wednesdays. We have the Peasant Cube drafts, which we've been talking about in this review, on Saturday nights at 7:30 Eastern. We have F&M style drafts on Fridays where players vote on a cube to play, and we have various guest cubes and user-submitted cubes on Saturday and Sunday mornings. You can find our socials on Twitter/X at JankDiverGaming, YouTube.com/JankDiverGaming. I believe Teld is working on a YouTube version of the Peasant Review there. And then you can also find Teld streaming occasionally on Twitch.tv/Teld Talks. I think that does it for this Peasant Review, and I look forward to in a week and a half when the next set comes out and we have to do 2 more back-to-back reviews. I'll get this out as soon as I possibly can, but if it's a little late, bear with me a little bit. But thanks for listening. We'll catch y'all next time. Oh man, where am I? Hey, anybody there? I could use some help here. Hello, and welcome to the Isle of Misfit One-Drops. It's not every day we get a new face around here. What's your name, pal? Oh, me? My name's Bonehorde Overseer. I just came out in Bloomburrow, and next thing I know, I'm here. Happens to the best of us, lad. Let me guess, they were talking about you on the podcast, decided you were really sweet, dropped you by the wayside, and never looked back? Yeah, that's pretty much it. Yeah, unfortunate, mate. That's just how the Divine Cube designers are. If you're not a 2/2 for 1 or some sort of Thraben inspector, that's just how they treat you around here. Anyway, as I said, welcome to the Isle of Misfit One-Drops. They call me Gilded Goose. I'll show you around. So that over there is Usher of the Fallen. He got here shortly before you, and he's been spending most of his time with the other Savannah Lions. What about that classy-looking fellow over there? That there is Warlock class. He might look classy and well-behaved, but he's a naughty little fellow who I'd recommend avoiding for now. Oh, and right there next to him, that's Embereth Veteran. He's not great. Let's just leave it at that. Yeah, I can tell just by looking at him that he sucks. Who's that guy there? Oh yeah, him. That's Shrieking Drake. Poor guy was in the cube for all of a week or two and they cut the sap loose. Hey, Shrieking Drake, how you holding up? Ah! Yeah, we don't talk to Shrieking Drake that much. They still have Dragonfly Pilot in the cube. I've been around since Visions. Ah! Like I said, not taking it well. Anyway, we've got a few others hanging around. There's Weaponize the Monsters. He's a bit of a bully. And that's Delighted Halfling over there. She's a bit of a legend around here. Oh, and that fellow way in the back? That's Treasure Cruise. He's a bit snooty on account of all the tournament play he saw. Wait a second, I know Treasure Cruise. Isn't that an 8-drop? No, I assure you it's definitely a 1-drop. Anyway, I'm trying to find someone, but I don't see him anywhere. Hey, Okiba Wreckin' a Raid, come over here for a second. Hey, what's up, Goose? Hey, we got a new guy here, and I was trying to introduce him to Lantern Bearer. I don't see him anywhere around here. Oh, Goose, you're not going to believe this. They actually put Lantern Bearer back in the mainline Jank Diver Cube. Hey, you have got to be shitting me.